And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's been kind of a wild week. Let's face it.
I'm used to every week being wild at this point.
Well, it's kind of fascinating because they're predicting a recession for 2023, don't you know?
We're already in a recession.
Somebody forgot to give them the memo on that one. But this is a way of sort of bracing themselves, you know, after they were trumpeting all this stuff and saying, hey, the Democrats won the election. Interestingly enough, the Senator Sinema there, interesting name, she switched over from Democrat to independent, so that majority is not looking too handy anymore. It's pretty interesting the way all that stuff's going back and forth right now, but it doesn't seem like those guys have a whole lot of answers. That's for sure. We have a very special episode for you tonight. It is X Series 141, and this is Female Targets, the Deep State JFK Assassination edition. There's a huge aerospace corridor around this as well. And in getting into this one, it's kind of, it's really breakthrough in terms of the information because of where we're going with it. And if you really look at the key players in this case, what we get generally are little pieces over here about Mary Meyer, or there's a little Maryland thing over there about JFK and Maryland, or there are little threads here and there. But if you put them together, then you have the real mosaic and you're getting the true picture of what's happening there. And there's been some excellent work done around these people individually. But if you don't thread them so that you see that whole tapestry, it's a very different thing. Tonight, we're going to look at that tapestry and see who was behind putting these very informed women out of commission, usually by actually their deaths. But actually, if you look closely, some of them are just destroyed, as was the case with Judith Campbell Exner, and marginalized and kind of kept in a certain state. I think when we look at some of the more obscure ones tonight, we're going to see that Karen Kupcinet is in there. Very interesting and very fascinating actress who comes into the JFK assassination in a strange fashion right on the day of the assassination. In fact, she calls the FBI and gives them information stating that in 30 minutes the president's going to be assassinated. And strangely enough, things don't go so well for her after that. The reason that there's so much of this in the air right now, you may have noticed, and I mentioned that there was going to be a press release. It actually happened on Tuesday at the National Press Club that was about the JFK assassination files and the lawsuit brought by the Mary Farrell Foundation, with Jefferson Morley now as part of that foundation. Morley's important because he was a Washington Post journalist who brought forward the story of George Joannides, which is the ultimate CIA secret. You know, that's the kind of the shell that they keep moving on that shell game of where the files are. His files and the Garrison files are the most important and crucial ones as we come in, you know, just coming out of that 59th anniversary. But December 15th is when all the records are supposed to come out. And you can only imagine, you know, the echoes through the ages of all these different researchers wondering, looking ahead, gee, in 2022, do you think those records would have come out? And I'm sure they're just ready to put up a new block on that and not let those records out to come up with some excuse. I've put it on the record here about Judge Napolitano and his very interesting conversations with President Trump that he released. And he related, this really put a lot of fire around these files because it showed that there was something in those files that President Trump found so disturbing that he felt it would really ruin America's position for a number of reasons. Now, you could say that's related to the CIA assassinating President Kennedy in 1963, but I have a feeling from all of the material around it that it's related directly to the UFO file. And there's also the great possibility, you know, it's a thing about records generally. When you say a record's going to come out, they've been housed in the government for so long. So you always figure, well, the CIA is not going to ever write down anything incriminating anyway, so what's the point? Well, we have actually got some interesting things over the years from the records, but I would be in that same camp, except for the fact that Bobby Kennedy, immediately after the assassination, got together with the CIA director and insisted on a few conditions, and also asked him where every agent was, and was going through a list of things of this nature. It's my belief, after hearing President Trump's conversation with Judge Napolitano, as Napolitano tells it, with him saying, hey, you're supposed to release these records because it was mandated by law and by Congress in 1992, that they released them in 2017, October 26th. And when Trump didn't do it, Napolitano called him, and Trump said, I can't release them. And Napolitano, who's a judge and giving legal advice to Trump for years, they're not on such great terms right now. But, he said, why can't you release them? And he said, you have no idea. Like, trust me, I can't do this. And Napolitano says, well, you're treating the American people like children. You promised you were going to do it. You have to do it. And Trump finally says, Andrew, there's no way that I can do this. So there's something in those records that's absolutely explosive after all, and that's what's been behind this dance here for 59 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, extra-constitutional illegal agency that President Truman, who set them up, wanted dissolved in 1963, shortly after the Kennedy assassination, and wrote so in the Washington Post. So we have a lot of interesting things over the year, but what's happened is, people assume, well, that was the CIA and the JFK's clash that was 60 years ago. And, the CIA got cleaned up and everything's back to normal, hunky-dory now. But they never got cleaned up. They never got reformed. And the kind of PR campaign that they did after they got caught with their hands in the assassination jars all over the place was to briefly offshore their operations under something called the Safari Club. And through the work of Peter Dale Scott and others, we find this, and then come back full force in the 80s, and then grow and have their own Air Force and all the rest of it. So the Central Intelligence Agency poses a huge problem in legalities, on political situations. They're largely behind as a conduit for other forces. The problems that we've seen in Ukraine, they staged an election there. They set up an assassination plot against Julian Assange. That's all within the last year. So the Central Intelligence Agency never got reformed, and all the reforms that were suggested went away after a while. And this thing has just taken off and grown, and it's implanted itself in other institutions. In the Department of Homeland Security, for example, there's a heavy CIA presence. And so, we have this DCI position, and which is the Director of National Intelligence, DNI, and then the DCI. So what we're looking at with the DNI is they're supposed to be in charge of all the intelligence, but it's just a functionary job, and all those people are CIA anyway. So you have a massive situation there of CIA control over these different elements, and that's what revolves around this whole story. When you see all these people turning up dead, that's what the CIA's business is, after all. So when we get into this, it's going to make it clear that a lot of these women got right in the middle, sometimes very, very bravely, of these situations, and were targeted out by these deep state forces. And that in most of the cases, it's all related directly to the Aerospace Exotic Group that protects the exotic technology in the UFO file. This thread, I think, opens us up dramatically, and we're going to get into that tonight. I want to remind you that in the second half of tonight's program, we're going to be taking your questions, and Miss Olivia will be putting those together for everyone. It's so great to have so many of you here with us. And Miss Olivia, before I go any further, what's going on out there?
Nunya Business says, Richard Hoagland gave you a big shout out on his podcast the other day.
I appreciate that. And, I've been meaning to have Richard on the show for years, and I've just greatly respect his work. And I have to say that one of the people who really, if you look at that arc of what's come out over the past 20 years or so in relation to space and the things that are going on, Hoagland's work really was ahead of its time. And so it's great to hear him out there. I feel like I've been getting some shout outs around, and that's a nice thing. it's great to have so many people picking up on the information as well. But I think particularly in this area where we have all the SpaceX stuff going on, which is largely getting glossed over because of all the Twitter files stuff that Musk is into now. It's particularly important to have people who have that space expertise. And Hoagland is one of those guys who was like, early on with what they were doing with airbrushing strange anomalies out of those NASA photos, like ruins on the moon. Yeah, that's kind of a problem. So we get into this situation, and where do you go for that kind of information? Who's looking at it? Well, look at all the moon and Mars ruins. Where does all that information take us? And it's a good point. It's something that Dr. Farrell brought up to me the last time we were talking, which is like before anyone ever landed on the moon or claimed to, there were tons in the 50s campaigns to take pictures of the moon. And a lot of that stuff got processed because we had satellites and there were, telescopes and all the rest of it. So, long before we ever had the like, hey, here's the Apollo shots, there's lots of pictures of the moon. And what's weird is there's a lot of talk in early UFO books about bridges on the moon, structures that look like bridges. And the people who are putting them out there have heavy, heavy astronomical credentials. So it makes you wonder, but don't worry about space, because tonight there's so much space going on in this report. You're not going to be wanting for any of it. I want to remind you before we start too, because I've heard this from a few people, and they'll ask, how can I find this update or this show? Just sign up for the newsletter. It's the best way to do anything. YouTube, I can't guarantee 100% is going to send you an update. Telegram and all these other things that we use, Twitter, Facebook just locked us out today, so we couldn't even post the show. You like that? They wanted my official government ID. Well, that's nice. Yeah, I've only been, on there for 10 years or whatever. And I think they have a lot of that stuff too. But this was a new gimmick, to get like a new phone number or something like that. So what I was looking at with these different sources is the best way to get around all of it is go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That keeps us in touch. That's a newsletter that comes out once a week. And, we'll just tell you whatever major shows that we have coming up, the incredible, and I mean incredible interviews that we have lined up for December and January, just off the charts, including a very important interview next Friday. I'm not going to say who, but you're definitely going to want to attend for that one. We might have a special report in between now and then as well. Have I covered everything on that front? What else you got?
Well, there's the question. Aaron's asking for later. Does DJ think the arising Twitter files by Musk and Taibbi will have any effect on the CIA, FBI programs? Do you think they're?
No, I think the Twitter files are incredibly lightweight, and you could, the big signal on that was the minute they let Jack Dorsey off within the first few tweets. That was Taibbi doing that. Hell, it looks like Jack didn't have anything to do with any of it. That was the warning shot that there was a big problem there. But also the kind of hubbub. Remember, a lot of the Musk stuff, and you have to remember this, is theater. And I know people get caught up in it. And there are some genuine things that happen. But if you want truth and transparency, you'll have to release all of the information they suppressed about COVID on Twitter. That would be number one. Releasing those accounts would be very important. And, you'd have to, this idea that Dorsey didn't know anything about it. And, that makes it sound like it's an inside thing to let him not take any responsibility. And when you're the CEO, you're the responsible officer of the company. So you can't claim that. You literally can't. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on with the Twitter files, unfortunately. And it's, it's worthwhile to look into it, but there's much bigger issues, Bankman-Fried, FTX is a much bigger story, in my opinion. The strange visits of Biden to the JFK library with Princess William recently, and the things that were coming out around the JFK assassination implicating the Central Intelligence Agency this is a very interesting story because of the arc of the story and how it cuts to the credibility of who is giving us all this information in the first place. So when we take it out into Twitter and all this kind of stuff, look, Musk, his main claim to fame is SpaceX. And he's in on all of the secret space infrastructure development. That's where real transparency would come from. I don't mean betray company secrets, but let's get real. There's been a secret space program. And so this kind of stuff that's like flitting around politics and social media and the suppression. Look, on this program, we outlined 5 years ago, the types of intense social media censorship that were going on. It's a part of what we know, all of us here in the Ideas Room and in the independent media community. So this is a kind of superficial disclosures of things. And I think what we're going to need to do going forward, looking at things, and I've mentioned this before in relation to stuff like Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, all these things when they come out and they talk about UFOs and it's supposed to be like, hey, we're big into transparency and all this stuff. And the problem is that all the people that they had on talking about these things were CIA people. So, there are big problems here. It's coming down to the potency of the information. And there you have very low potency shows, so even though they're talking about the right subjects, there's nothing, it's like 1 inch level deep. So you're going to have to go very deep to get to the truth about these things and have actual disclosure instead of grandstanding, I'm doing all this for humanity, and letting this Twitter CEO off the hook. It doesn't add up. So it's a kind of it's a program that they decided back there that they needed a counterweight to suppressing everybody. And so now they have their other solution, and this goes back to political things where they set up the problem and then create the solution. So I'm sorry, in terms of that particular wave of information that's coming out, I don't have a whole lot of faith in the sources, but the general trend that's been realized inside of the Davos crowd is they really understand that their suppression has gotten them into trouble and that the push against freedom of speech has made them look really bad. And remember, one of the things that crowd doesn't like is that once in a while, a psycho inside goes off the rails and embarrasses them. And so, we've seen some of that going on. And I think that this is the nature of what we're seeing, is that there's a battle in there to regain some trust in the public, because there was a group, there's an active group inside there that says, we don't need the public. We can just do this. We can mow over 8 billion people, So, that crowd is the insane crowd. And the other crowd operates a little more like the Rockefellers. They're like, well, we have to do this, but we have to do it, around corners and through organizations and fronts and all this kind of stuff. We can't come out and say, we want your kids as slaves and we want you plugged into a chip tower so you can create digital currency with the energy in your body. This is a lot about getting real. So when you see things like the Twitter files and stuff, it's sort of like entertainment on the surface. It doesn't go so deep. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight, though, in the Female Targets episode, and we're looking very deeply at what happened in relation to the assassinations and how this was tied in with this X-Protect group. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the program. If you have nothing else, Miss Olivia, I'll jump in.
Go for it.
All right. So let's take a look at some of the organizations that are going on here. Let's set up the scene a little bit. So in the American deep state in the late 50s, they've developed a real edge by utilizing the technology that is the X technology. And all that resides inside the UFO file. And some of that's related to the exotic technology that we've developed, and some of it is an outside source. And the wave of secrecy around this has created its own secondary government. And that government is utilizing continuity of government protocols, which give them ultimate secrecy. Those protocols were set up under Eisenhower, originally suggested under Truman, but really come into full fruition. Eisenhower got the highways program and all that going in the 50s, but he also developed a massive, and I mean massive, underground base program. And that's why the 50s have such a jobs piece to them. You know, everybody gets a piece of the pie, the GI Bill and everything else. But there's this also hidden finance structure, which is financing all the money that's building underground bases and things of this nature. Now, fundamentally, when you look at why they were doing this, it made sense because of the nuclear impasse that the world was in at that time, and America was facing with the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union had stolen atomic secrets from the US and built their own atom bombs. This is the way it works. And that whole story has some interesting pieces to it. A lot of the people that show up in some of those early stages will, you know, kind of reformat and come back around in 1963 for the Kennedy assassination story to play itself out. What we're looking at with the period of time when we get to John F. Kennedy is we're looking at Kennedy coming in and being aware of this. So they're not used to that in government, that somebody coming in from the outside, as Kennedy was, and with the money that the Kennedys had and the influence. And I want to stress that their money level, you know, is not very well understood when we look back on it today. It needs to be understood on like a Bill Gates money level. That is the Kennedys and their influence financially across all these different spectrums, theater, you know, liquor businesses, just an incredible swath of businesses that Joseph Kennedy developed from his Wall Street trading days. And then going into government and saying, someone, you know, I'm going to go straight to the presidency. You know, this whole piece of him and his family legacy and his drive comes part of the Kennedy myth and legend. And it is Joe who becomes ambassador to the UK. He's somebody who helped, you know, Roosevelt set up the SEC and all these other things to keep an eye after the Depression on all these people who had exploited the system. And it's well known that he wants to run for president. So this is Roosevelt keeping an eye on Joe Kennedy, who's Kennedy's father. Joe Kennedy is very important because he has all the contacts in that period. So when you get into the Depression period, you're talking about all the Wall Street contacts. You're talking about Hollywood is just blossoming in that period. It's going from silent to talkie movies. And you're also talking about the mafia. You know, you've got Al Capone in Chicago, and you have all these developing trends of mafia, and you have all the prohibition piece and the gigantic criminal corridor that creates. And, you know, that's left in place for a long time. I think there's something like 13 years of prohibition in the United States. So during that whole period, you have, you know, basically the drug wars, but they're liquor wars. So by the time Joe becomes the ambassador to the UK, he's very successful. His family's over there, and they're the darling of the English press and everything. And the Kennedys, especially John, gets a feel for being around that English world. And he sees how world governments work by being around there and having all those connections. By the time he's in American government, he has so many worldwide connections that he's a natural to become a candidate for president because he's so well informed. Joe himself will make a big mistake when he's ambassador to the UK. And he's over there and he's talking, you know, and there are all these victories that Hitler is having and all the rest. And basically, Joe says, well, you know, like, love him or hate him, you're going to have to deal with these fascists one way or another. And, you know, we should just kind of recognize that times are changing. And there's this kind of acceptance of the growth of this fascist movement going on in Europe. And that conversation plummets his entire reputation. And eventually he's withdrawn from the UK. And the family has suffered a real blow. For Joe Kennedy to make a mistake like that was pretty major and shot his presidential ambitions. And he immediately turned and said, my son, Joe Jr., is going to be president. So he sets him up and he makes sure when World War II hits that both John and Joe are in the Army and in the Navy. Now, what happens is Joe gets into a very secret mission. And it's flying these munitions into Europe, and the plane explodes. Now, a lot of people have suggested with the strange plane crashes and the deaths around the Kennedy that the assassination program around the Kennedy started very early from these groups looking at them, what they wanted to do, the types of vision that they have for the world. And it could very well be true. And certainly the case is unusual. But what it does, in essence, is it electrifies their search in the family for another person who can handle this role of becoming president. And so Joe turns to John, and it's interesting because John doesn't have a whole lot of interest in it. And as it turns out, he wants to be a journalist, and the father's like, no, you're going to become a congressman. And boom, by 29 years old, he's a congressman. And he's also very unusual in this sense in that he is shy, which is tricky for a politician. And he's also a deep thinker, which is also kind of tricky when you get to politics. So, but he's very well read, and he is a world traveler at this point. So he has these incredible advantages. And so when Kennedy goes through Congress and he goes through the Senate, he picks up a number of influences along the way. And then by 1960, it's looking very good that he is going to be the candidate for president, even though the old guard Democrats are watching him warily. And so people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Truman, they're all against Kennedy. And they're saying, no, we want the old guard. So Kennedy really rolls in there, and he has to win a lot of people over. One of the things that he does is he is spending a lot of time trying to figure out avenues in particular states that are going to be tricky, but how they can be swung over to the Democratic Party. And Nevada and Chicago are two of the major places that he looks at. Now, one of his friends along the line, in this regard, when he's looking at help in Nevada and Chicago, is he develops a friendship with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra is known to be interested in getting involved in the political scene, and he is also incredibly influential. But the problem is that he has a tremendous mafia background, and it's worked as a real liability for him around those circles. Now, Joe Kennedy gave John Kennedy an incredible understanding and connections with the mob, but the father was always way more involved around that for his own businesses. Jack growing up, Bobby growing up, they weren't well steeped in the context. They didn't use them the way that Joe did. And so the Kennedy family largely leaves behind the mafia influences by the time you get into the 50s. Now, Sinatra is going to be a very interesting and mixed bag for Kennedy because he is going to help him deliver Chicago and Nevada. But he's going to do it with the help of this man who's a heavy-duty mafia figure named Sam Giancana. Now, Giancana is a powerful force, and he's heavily involved with the Chicago mob. So he's basically the godfather of the Chicago mob, and he's moving his operations into Las Vegas. Now, Giancana also, has a strange background. He's a real psychopath. During World War II, when he was drafted in, and the psychologist sort of sized him up and was like, oh, this guy, we can't use this guy as a complete psycho. He's basically a psycho killer. But they asked, is there anything we can do with him? Can we use him for psychological operations, for example? And the psychiatrist was like, oh, yeah, he'd be great for that. So he was used as almost like a guinea pig. And they wanted to see, how somebody with no conscience operated. And so he has an interesting that's a weird thread in his background. But his connections with the mafia go all the way back to the 1930s. Sinatra himself becomes so indebted to the mafia that he is, all of his activities in Hollywood, all of his activities around music become just surrounded by this influence. And he finds himself playing nonstop just in Las Vegas. He's not touring in England. He's not touring in Paris. He's in Las Vegas. And that is due largely to just this incredible focus around the mafia people wanting their entertainment, wanting to draw things into that. And Sinatra has this incredible downline of mafia going all the way back to when he was growing up in New Jersey, and his mother being, really involved as part of this whole early mafia setup. And so he, was around all these musicians and ladies of the night and all this stuff. And he also had a very difficult upbringing that, his mother beat him. And so Sinatra is a very complex character when we get around all this. Sinatra's going to be the conduit between JFK and Giancana. And that becomes important because one of the main female targets in all of this is Judith Campbell Exner. And this is a woman that Sinatra is going to introduce to JFK as a way to impress him. I can get you beautiful women, that kind of thing. But he also is good friends with Marilyn. And this is an interesting thing where Jack is repeating some of the problems and the mistakes that his dad had in Hollywood. And his dad got all wrapped up in this Gloria Swanson relationship, and it became a scandal for him and all these types of things. And he owned a number of theaters. He had a large Hollywood business himself. So here is Jack kind of getting involved with the glamour of the whole Hollywood thing, which wasn't really a big part of what he was doing beforehand. But now that he's going to be president, and he needs to put these contacts together, he's getting much more into that scene. And on the Sinatra side, he's saying to the mafia people, I can get you a great liaison. This can be really good. If we can help Jack, we can really make this thing happen. So there's a lot of this that's going on. By the way, his opponent, Richard Nixon, is trying to use Carlos Marcello and Santos Trafficante, these other media and mafia figures in Florida and Louisiana, to help them swing that Republican. So, this is just a game that's going on in 1960 in that period, because, and the mafia influence never goes away. It just kind of, it's really at that point at a real zenith. And interestingly enough, in the 1950s, you're seeing all these committees like the Kefauver Committee and Robert Kennedy's labor union committees, taking down the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa and all these people. And it's starting to become obvious that basically everything is run by organized crime. And so the government has to take a role back here. And one of the reasons for that is one of the great beneficiaries of the mafia is J. Edgar Hoover. And they do all kinds of wonderful things for him. He has he likes to go to the track and all that stuff. And there's an old series of records that tell us that he was being blackmailed himself because of his gay relationship with his FBI Lieutenant Clyde Tolson. Now that's all out of the bag. The extent of the blackmail is interesting because he won't even use the word mafia until RFK starts prosecuting mafia figures. Then he has to. So there's all of this as the backdrop coming in. But remember, too, that Kennedy and Nixon, when they face off in 60, this is them in 1946. They've known each other for 14 years. They both came in there. And so they're sort of equally matched in a number of ways by the time the 1960 election comes around, which is why that election is such a standoff and why it's just decided by a few votes, because basically they all have the same level of contacts going on here. Nixon's been VP for 8 years, and Kennedy has been in the Senate, as a leading candidate. Plus, he has all of his father's influences. But very early on, they were friends. This is interesting, too. So when they were in the Congress, they had kind of an appreciation for each other. What Sinatra is telling JFK as a senator is that mafia influence that's sucking up to Nixon. I can swing that your way, baby. If you go my way. So Kennedy takes the bait, and he gets Sinatra working for him. Now, of course, like I said, Sinatra gets him into Maryland, but first, this whole situation comes about with Judith Exner, and she's very important, and her life is absolutely fascinating. There have been some books about her, but nothing's really captured her. In fact, as I've gone through deep sources on her, listened to her interviews, read her own books, I feel like her story is not very well understood, and there's a major, and I mean major, Black aerospace influence associated with this, which is totally behind the scenes on all of it. And we're going to get into that right now with Judith Campbell Exner. Of course, there's a Hollywood connection too, because she's right there. And guess who her next door neighbor is? Bob Hope, baby.
Wow.
Mr. Comedy himself. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on female targets. This is the Deep State JFK Assassination edition of Female Targets. We've done actually 4 episodes of Female Targets. The first one, of course, was Vicki Morgan, who was the high-priced call girl, worked in those Khashoggi circles, and was bumped off by high lieutenants in the Reagan administration. And a very interesting, powerful story right there in Hollywood as well. The follow-up one that we did had to do with George Hodel and Michelle Phillips and the Black Dahlia murder. It's quite fascinating. And there's a thread of Hodel that comes up tonight as well. We're going to get into that. And then it was Sue Lyon from Lolita, who also comes right out of that and was coached by that Hodel crowd. Actually, it was Hodel's daughter that got her the audition there with Stanley Kubrick. So a lot of interesting crossovers with female targets. One of the reasons I put this together is that deep state operation, it has to be understood how they go after women in a different fashion than they do after men. And we have to see that this is a long-standing history of targeting these women who were so close and involved in these situations that they were absolutely explosive. And the kind of heroism that's involved in these stories and the complexities of who these women are is something that we're going to bring forward for you tonight. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, especially if you're new here. That's a newsletter that we have going on. It just comes out to you once a week. Not a lot of marketing there, but very important if you want to know the incredible interviews, X-series episodes, events, all of it is in there for December and January. Make sure that you're signed up to that free newsletter as we go. Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Good. C.A. Beverforden wants to know, what about Peter Lawford, who was part of the Rat Pack and JFK's brother-in-law?
Well, he's a pivotal intermediary contact for us. And there's a couple of stories that are crucial about him. One of the interesting stories I find is that right after the Kennedy assassination, his wife divorces him 8 days later. I found that interesting. But Lawford, of course, was Kennedy's brother-in-law and also in the Rat Pack and friends with Sinatra and that whole connection to Hollywood, Sammy Davis Jr., all of them. But the other thing that's interesting about Lawford is that he's close to Marilyn. And there's that thread. The other, I think, compelling piece about Lawford and Sinatra's history is that, there's a period after the inauguration and the ball and all the rest that Sinatra is really riding high, and he thinks that JFK is going to do everything with him now. And what happens is, in order to do all this for JFK, Sinatra got a call from Bobby Kennedy, who said, you've got this mobster, that mobster, this other mobster, and this mobster all working in your casino. You have to get those guys out of there because we can't have anything to do with that. And Sinatra said, I had no idea. I'll take care of all of it, and all those guys just go away. But he does the inauguration, and then Bobby Kennedy finds out immediately that all those guys are back. So Bobby Kennedy gives Sinatra a call again and says, hey, get rid of those mobsters or we can't deal with you. And Sinatra is really peeved at this point. He's like, I'm close with Jack, nothing's going to stop that, from going on. You can't give me orders, all this kind of stuff. And he's really, flashing his anger. So Bobby goes back and tells Jack, we can't deal with this guy. He actually is keeping on with all the mob thing, and he's going to be a public relations nightmare. Cut him fast. Now, it's interesting because Kennedy is going to the West Coast, and he's supposed to be staying at Sinatra's when he goes there. Instead, he goes and stays at Bing Crosby's. It's a much safer
Mhm.
individual, less mob involved, but he's a Republican, so that is kind of weird. And so anyway, the upshot is that Sinatra actually built an airstrip on his property for Kennedy's helicopter to land. And so he destroys it, and then they send
He
Peter.
personally destroys it.
He personally destroys it, but they send Peter Lawford to give him the bad news. And because he delivers that bad news, Sinatra will never speak to him again. The only time Sinatra is going to speak to him, it's going to be briefly, is when Sinatra's son is kidnapped right after the Kennedy assassination, which is also, kind of interesting timing there. But Peter Lawford will check in. Do you need anything? And that's it. This is the level of grudge that Sinatra held for Peter Lawford after all this happened. But in the middle of this, there was a woman that he went out with for just a few weeks before he realized she can't take this kind of level that I'm at. And it just didn't work out. She's 18 years old and old blue eyes, is already in his late 40s. So, and that is Judith Campbell. Now, it's interesting. Judith will end up marrying a Hollywood actor, and that's Robert Campbell. And it's interesting because he kind of another entree into that world. William Campbell, yes.
Mhm.
And he's another entree into this world. But there she is coming in.
I see that picture coming.
There's no question. And so she's, this incredible beauty. Her dad is a famous architect, and they're friends with the glitterati in Hollywood. Like I said, Bob Hope comes over every week. It's a grand old time. And her sister is, already an actress, and she is interested in being one. Now, Judith's husband kind of introduces her to this world, and that's him there. William Campbell, and he his own career is pretty interesting. They're hustling through trying to make him into a big star, and he's a steady worker, but he never becomes the big star that they hope him to be. But in any case, here she is, 18 years old, going to all these Hollywood, openings and all the rest of it. Now, you might, if you're a Star Trek fan, you're going to realize that is Trelane.
Right on.
From the Trelane episode, who Kirk called a god of war. But this is a fantastic episode about someone who's trapped there in the 19th century and tries to bring the Star Trek Enterprise back. But it's very interesting. That's where the Campbell comes from in her name. Later, she will marry a golf pro named Exner, and that's why. So we're just going to call her Judith Exner throughout. Now, for some reason, because she's Catholic, beyond her beauty and everything else, JFK has bigger plans for her than just going out with her. He actually wants to see her on a regular basis. And it's interesting because Sinatra has introduced them. But on the flip side, Sinatra has also introduced her to someone he's calling Sam Flood. And Sam Flood is Sam Giancana. And he's saying to her, hey, this guy, he thinks you're great and you should know him. He's really connected in, Chicago, Las Vegas. He's going to help you out a lot. And here she is kind of in the scene. So she is spending time with Giancana. The same time she's meeting Kennedy. So Kennedy starts to make all these plans with her. So she's flying to DC, she's flying to Florida, and she's really, developing this regular behind the scenes affair with candidate Kennedy. This is before he's president. Now, one of the things that happens during this period is he knows that she is seeing Giancana, and he's saying, one, I don't want you to see him. And two, here's all this stuff about him. I do want you to maintain this contact with him because he's connected to all of these different people that we're working with for the campaign. And I want you to deliver him papers. And this is where her life goes off a very interesting cliff because she becomes an object of the FBI who are fascinated by what's going on here. and they're also very interested in what those papers are. There's a traditional understanding that Giancana was related to assassination plots concerning Fidel Castro in Cuba. But I think if you a deeper look at what is happening with Judith Campbell and Giancana and the messages that are being sent is that there's a kind of surveillance of the CIA that the Kennedy White House is doing. And I'm going to really dive deep on this. And it gets right into the aerospace part. And I believe it's right in that corridor of the aerospace UFO file X-Protect piece. I'm going to show you how that all works and how these three people, Exner, Giancana, and Kennedy, get into this. And it becomes quite fascinating. And to see Sinatra sitting right in the middle of this, just trying to hook up the best possible deal for his political mafia entertainment world is interesting, because what he does is he brings into view X-Protect for just like a short period in history. And we're going to go back and see what this is all about. Now, a couple of facts on Exner that I think are important here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 141. We're going deep tonight on female targets. This is the JFK Deep State Assassination edition. And we find ourselves right now looking deeply at Judith Exner, who was romantically involved, but then later with President Kennedy, but then later is going to be used in all these committees to out a number of different figures. Okay. So one of the things when we look at is that at a certain point in her life, in 1962, when she's still seeing Kennedy, but it's become on the FBI radar, and they have to be a lot more careful. So the FBI is doing a stakeout of Kennedy's love nest with Judith Exner, and it's her apartment in Los Angeles. And they see these guys breaking in, and they wonder what's going on with that. And these guys break in, and they spend some time there, but she's not there, and neither is Kennedy. So they spend some time in there. Boom, they pop off the balcony, they jump out, they leave. I'm going to read you the actual report, but I'm just going to give you the setup first. So they jump off, and they're off and away, but the FBI has the car, the descriptions, and all the rest of it. This is going to become important, and it's going to open up the aerospace piece of this. So years and years later, Seymour Hersh, who wrote The Dark Side of Camelot, and it's kind of an interesting guy because he did a lot of early exposés on Vietnam and things of that nature, and was really against the CIA for a long time. One of the things that Professor Scott told me is that somewhere in about the 1990s, the CIA started to say to him, basically, we'll feed you, we'll give you some direct information if you take it easy on us and if you see where we're coming from and things of this nature. So Hersh, when he gets to Kennedy, instead of laying the Kennedy assassination at the CIA's door, he turns against the Kennedys. Now, this is a thing. It's a theme that is ongoing, by the way. You might see all these books that are coming out recently that allege that Bobby had Marilyn murdered and things of this nature. This is a CIA trick. This is what they do. It's literal gaslighting of the public. They've been so deeply involved in the assassination of these public figures that they take the public figures that they've killed and they demonize them. So they leave a trail for that. And then when the movies come up and the books come up, they come up and promote them. So right now,
that's dark.
Yeah. Well, think about, is it Marky Mark, right?
Mm.
Right. And he now is putting money behind a movie about Bobby killing Marilyn, because Netflix did a Marilyn series. There's a lot of problems with this. And this is how the CIA controls the narratives around things, so that when people think, I understand certain things about the past. Now I can see the CIA eliminated the Kennedys because of these reasons. They throw in the junk conspiracy and they're like, no, actually the Kennedys killed Marilyn. See how that works? So the question, when you get down to those narratives, is beyond the headlines and all the rest of it. Is where is that coming from? Well, it's very interesting when we get around Exner, because Exner is an open door. She's a target of the FBI. She's a target of the CIA. And they know that she's been delivering these messages on behalf of the president. So she's called before a congressional committee in 1975. And as soon as she comes up, that's a committee that's investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. I have a picture of her seeing that committee. But as soon as she does it, in fact, Giancana is shot execution style. Giancana is going to also be called before this committee. So what's in play here is that they're looking at him and saying, this is the guy that we used for a number of CIA assassination plots with the mafia. And we don't know what he was doing in relation to the Kennedy White House, but whatever is going on here, we're going to shut him up. So he's executed in a style that suggests that you've talked too much. And it's interesting because, they set up the whole thing where he has his dinner and he's sitting there, and then, boom, they assassinate him. This is a part of a string of deaths that goes on whenever we get into any Kennedy investigations. We saw it originally with the Warren Commission investigation. There's all some very unusual deaths, lists of very strange deaths associated with it. And then second level people associated with their strange deaths. I was just reading about the death of the cab driver who took Oswald from the Texas School Book Depository to his home in Oak Cliff. And the cab driver ended up in a very strange accident just a couple of months later. So whoever he was ferrying there in the taxi cab, they didn't want him to identify whoever that was. So there's a whole series of those. But the 70s ones are particularly interesting because it's the second wave. And you have people like Johnny Roselli, who is, again, an Exner Sinatra contact. And these are people who are involved with Giancana. So Roselli becomes involved in the CIA mafia plots. And the CIA mafia plots are, we want you to assassinate Fidel Castro. By the way, they angle this a lot around Castro. The CIA used the mafia dramatically to assassinate anyone who was in their way. So the fact that they were the go-to for Castro, he's just one of the guys that they wanted to get off the board. And, it's very interesting to me whenever you get around the JFK researchers who go into the mafia angle and say, well, the mafia killed JFK. Basically, the problem with all of those theories is that the mafia can't control the number of things that went on in this case. And it's dramatic when you think about it, because what happened was, the autopsies were altered, brains disappeared, the limo got, the windshield of the limo got switched out. John Connolly's suit got sent to the dry cleaner. That's stuff that the mafia can't do. That's all government work. It's government cover-up assisted by the media, and that, you need the intelligence agencies for that. So whenever you hear that, just remember that the mafia was working for the Central Intelligence Agency at that point. So they're hired guns, from the Central Intelligence Agency. Who's doing the actual shooting? Who's behind it? And the way that I look at it is, they would probably use mafia figures for the assassinations, but, the mafia isn't the one plotting the whole thing, and they can't do all these government pieces in relation to it. So it doesn't make sense. There's a lot of that going around now, and it's always been the go-to position of the CIA that if the heat got too heavy, they would throw the mafia out there. And they did it. They did it as far back as the 70s. So when you look at it, the problem with the Kennedy assassination in relation to the Central Intelligence Agency is that, all of their authority as an organization goes away, And do you remember this? What is it? Game of Thrones. What do they call the guy? He's Kingslayer, right? you can't have murdered your own president and then people want to join the CIA or people respect. That'll be the end of the Central Intelligence Agency if that comes out. So they've done everything, but that whole structure has, not just the CIA. And this is a main problem. It's part of the America through the looking glass thing that we've been going into. And this is why so many things are going on unchecked, because we've been in unchecked territory for 60 years. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 141, deep on female targets here. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of this, which is in about, I'll try to finish all this in like the next hour. Before we go any further, Miss Olivia.
Renee Smith is asking, was Judith Campbell a honeypot for a particular organization?
Well, it's interesting. Mae Brussels, a 70s researcher and 80s researcher who did some remarkable work on the Kennedy assassination, she had some very interesting things to say about Exner, which I'm going to quote here to respond to your question, so it's well-timed. Mm-hmm. In November 1960, it would be Nixon versus Kennedy. Frank Sinatra introduced Judith Exner to John Kennedy on the eve of the New Hampshire primary. A few weeks later, Sinatra introduced Judith Exner to Chicago mafia boss Sam Giancana. I want you to underline Chicago tonight because everything is going to kind of come back around to Chicago, as it turns out. Exner became involved, as William Safire put it, in a dual affair with the nation's most powerful mobster and the nation's most powerful political leader. Giancana was busy with more than his love life. He was hired to form assassination teams to kill Fidel Castro. He was retained by Robert Mayhew, who shows up in our documentary. He's the guy who's involved in running Howard Hughes' business, and he's deeply involved in the Robert Kennedy assassination. Robert Mayhew is a former FBI CIA operative. Mayhew never mentioned that the CIA was behind it. He intimated to Giancana that wealthy Cuban exiles were the source of the funds. This sounded plausible since Mayhew was Howard Hughes' right-hand man. Giancana placed Johnny Roselli, his Los Angeles lieutenant, in charge of the hit squads. In 1978, when the House Select Committee questioned him, Roselli hinted that his assignment was aimed at Kennedy as well as Castro. Shortly afterwards, his mutilated body was found floating in an oil drum off the Florida coast. And this is that pattern that we're talking about. These guys, once they get used, they don't want them for anything else. So if a congressional committee comes up, they're just going to get rid of them. But there is Exner in the middle of all this. And, she's pretty young when she gets involved with Sinatra. And she's a little older by the time she's dating Kennedy, but it's still a gigantic imbalance in terms of their places in life. So along the way here, an unusual piece opens up, which is, I'm going to go back to the FBI noticing there are people breaking in to Exner's apartment in Los Angeles. So Seymour Hersh gets his hands on the FBI report by saying, hey, I'm putting out this book now and I want all the details. What have you got? And this gets pretty interesting. So it turns out that the people who were breaking in were twins. And the twins were the sons of a defense contractor executive named I.B. Hale. Now, this is interesting because one of the twins has an interesting connection to John Connolly in that he was married to Connolly's daughter, who appears to be another female target. And the daughter is named Kathleen. They called her KK. But what's fascinating is she runs away with Hale. And this is John Connolly and his family. That's without Kathleen there. That's with the rest of the family. And Connolly will become the governor of Texas, and he will be shot in the car with Kennedy. But, they create the famous magic bullet for him. But he doesn't die as a result of that, of course. And he goes on to work for President Nixon, interestingly enough. But Kathleen runs away with one of those twins. who are sons with who are the sons of I.B. Hale, who's working for General Dynamics. Now, a little bit on I.B. Hale here. Hale is a former special agent with the FBI, and he goes and he becomes an executive at General Dynamics, and General Dynamics is creating the ultimate in secret aerospace developments. And they develop a contract there, which is one of the largest contracts going on in that period, which we're going to get into. And they're trying to get that contract swung over to them instead of Boeing, which is what the JFK White House is looking at giving it to them, to Boeing instead of General Dynamics. Now, what's interesting about this is the history and the thread that goes on here in relation to this. So Hirsch, when he gets the FBI document later, he decides that if they were breaking in, these two twins who were sons of I.B. Hale, if they were breaking into Judith Exner's place to get blackmail material or to plant bugs so that they could record Kennedy when he was with Exner, that they could use that as blackmail to blackmailing him into getting the contract for them. So if we go back just a little bit, Connolly's daughter is dating one of these Hales. Here's another weird thing. Both the Hales went to school with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now that's at Beauregard High School. Let's think about that in Fort Worth. This is unusual. So we have Connolly, his kids, his daughter is going to a high school, and then who the daughter is seeing, the brother and his twin are going to the same high school as Lee Harvey Oswald. And then later, these twins are going to break in to Kennedy's mistress's apartment while the FBI watches and doesn't do anything, by the way, because their old buddy, I.B. Hale, it turns out they figure out that the car is I.B. Hale's car that they're doing this with, which is how it all tracks back. So this is Kathleen. What happens to Kathleen? Kathleen is John Connolly's daughter, and Governor Connolly doesn't want her to see Hale, but they take off. They run away from Texas, and first they go to Oklahoma, then to Florida. So what's happening with Kathleen is she becomes pregnant, and then somewhere there's a police report about neighbors hearing a shot. The police show up, and there is Hale, Robert Allen Hale, and he is about to jump out the window saying, "Oh, she killed herself." But since it was with a shotgun, the whole police report is very strange, and they take him to jail. And so the whole case goes through this strange kind of 3-day waiting period, and then suddenly they decide it was an accident. And Hale goes free, and there's no explanation except that she was distraught and somehow had a shotgun and shot herself. A lot of friends of hers describe her as being upset and distraught about all the things that were going on, but they describe him that way also. So there's, the police who were involved said they couldn't prove it one way or another. This strange little factoid that's hanging out there in history is quite fascinating, though, when we get to Connolly. So we're going to see how this all plays out. Let's get to the next piece of this. Now, we have the next part of John Connolly, what happens in his life after his daughter is killed, is that he becomes the Secretary of the Navy. He is Secretary of the Navy, and he becomes the governor of Texas. Now, when he becomes governor of Texas, one of the first things that he will do is start to figure out how Kennedy can come down there to Texas. Now, a little history on Connolly, and he's very important because he's there in the assassination car when Kennedy is assassinated. Connolly is the governor, but it's not like he's been governor for all these years. He just got in, as a matter of fact. So when Kennedy is there and they set up the motorcade and all these things are done, Connolly is a new governor of Texas. Then when you look at Connolly of where he's coming out of, he was Secretary of the Navy. Well, who writes to him when he's Secretary of the Navy? Lee Harvey Oswald writes him a letter. And it's basically about, conditions for people in the Navy. And it's one of these weird things that they had Oswald do to put him on record. Let's make him look like he's giving all these political people a hard time. Still, the letter is unusual, and it mentions Ernest Hemingway.
It does?
Yeah. Well, there are 3 letters that Oswald writes that mention Hemingway. So that's just kind of...
Is that code?
Well, it makes you wonder when we get to Oswald and the things that he's laying out, so many of the things that, he's talking so much in spy language that for me, a lot of what Oswald does is steganography. I would say another thing that's going on with Connolly is that he has been involved as a lawyer around LBJ, and he's been LBJ's kind of go-to man since the 40s. They also say that he was the only person that LBJ was afraid of, which is pretty interesting. And one of the things that I think is fascinating is that the person who doesn't want John Connolly in the car with Kennedy and has a huge fight with JFK and his people that morning so that Kennedy shouldn't have Connolly in the car. He should have Ralph Yarborough, who's the senator, and that Connolly should ride with Lyndon since they're friends. And Kennedy says, no, he's the governor. This is the way you do it. And I know you don't like Yarborough, but that's too bad. So he wants Yarborough in the car, probably because he wants him to go down with Kennedy as well. He's like, I can get rid of both of them. When we get into LBJ too, we have to see that when we're dealing with Connolly, he's LBJ's man. So that has to be kept in mind as we go through this. But something strange is going on with this death of Connolly's daughter. What's interesting to contemplate is that right after Connolly's daughter dies, then he gives over the Navy leadership to Fred Korth. And it's interesting because Korth has another close relationship with LBJ as well. But Korth also has a daughter who will also die of a shotgun wound. So
to the face?
Yes.
Oh my
and
God.
What's to the head. And what's interesting is that they're both secretaries of the Navy, and they both have teenage daughters who died by shotgun blast. For me, yeah, that was getting into some interesting territory. So let's take a look at someone who shows up in the middle of all this when we think about LBJ for a minute. And she's also a female target. I didn't list her in the thumbnail, but it is actually Jackie Kennedy. And Jackie there being seen at the swearing in is very interesting because LBJ said after the assassination, when she was on the plane, Air Force One, you have to be there. You have to take this picture with me because, otherwise it really is going to look like he was involved. But if she's there, then it takes a lot of the heat off. And it's interesting because when we're looking at LBJ and what was going on when the limousine was going from Love Field past the Texas School Book Depository, when they take that turn on Elm Street, what's going on with our friend LBJ? Well, a number of his associates are going to prison. It's already official behind the scenes that Kennedy is dropping him from the ticket. That's something that Nixon tells the Dallas Morning News the day before the assassination. And so we have all these pieces out there that what's going to happen to Lyndon as soon as 64 shows up is Kennedy's going to dump him because he has all these scandals going on. A number of his friends are going to prison, and he's going to go to prison. Now, he's going to go to prison for dirty dealings in the Senate and dirty dealings in Texas. I'm going to do, and I've done pieces on LBJ, but we'll do a separate thing on him altogether. But interestingly enough, something that gets lost in all of this is that Jackie, when the president dies, a couple months later, leaves all these tapes, records all these tapes with a journalist named William Manchester. And she wants them released for posterity either 75 years from then or 50 years after her children have died, one of the two. So in those tapes, it's always been, everyone's always wondered what was in those tapes. Well, those tapes were held under lock and key. And then a very strange thing happens, which is there's going to be an ABC series, which is all about the Kennedys. And it's going to be a hit job. And it's going to be, you know, them and all their women and all this kind of stuff. And Carolyn Kennedy makes a deal. She says, well, if you don't do this miniseries, if you stop it from coming out, I'll give you the tapes early. So there's a person who's recording, transcribing the tapes at the JFK library. And in the middle of it, she can't believe what she's hearing because Jackie is saying, oh, I'm sure LBJ was behind the assassination. Now, this story came out in full. It had good sources. It was blast through not just the national media, international media. And I have it. I have a number of different versions of it. It came out August 8th, 2011. There's one version of it. Explosive Jackie O tapes reveal she believed LBJ killed JFK. And there's some other stuff in there. But what's important is that she goes on the record with this. What happens is sanitized versions of these tapes come out, and they do, you know, they decide we're not going to run this Salacious Kennedy miniseries thing. But here's just a little bit from this article because it's lost to history, very much like during the Boston bombings, the JFK library was on fire, and that's lost to history. But I've got all the data on it, so it's sort of a problem, you know, that when you have stuff that's supposed to be memory hold, but it's not. Jackie Onassis believed that Lyndon B. Johnson and a cabal of Texas tycoons were involved in the assassination of her husband, John F. Kennedy. Explosive recordings are set to reveal. The secret tapes will show that the former First Lady felt that her husband's successor was at the heart of the plot to murder him. She became convinced that the then vice president, along with businessmen in the South, had orchestrated the Dallas shooting. That's important because we have to remember who we're dealing with in LBJ. So when we get around Connolly, LBJ, you know, this is Jackie who's dealt with LBJ for years as vice president and listened to Jack talk about him and all the rest of it. She thinks immediately in these tapes, which are recorded only 2 months after the assassination, that it was LBJ who was behind it. Bobby Kennedy instantly sent over messages to the Soviet Union saying, we know it was a domestic conspiracy that killed my brother. So, you know, all of this stuff about, oh, Russia, you know, and Cuba and all these things, you know, that wasn't the position of the Kennedys, who were in a position to know who their enemies were. And they definitely felt that the Central Intelligence Agency and LBJ were collaborating here. Now, the story of those tapes is weird because the sanitized tapes that come out don't talk anything about LBJ at all. And Carolyn Kennedy gave the tapes over early, but the stealth archive of the real tapes are out there, in fact. What's interesting also is that at the Kennedy Library are records that are very much like the Mar-a-Lago situation. Immediately after the assassination, RFK goes to the White House and takes documents about programs that the JFK White House was involved in. And I'm sure that a number of those are related to the aerospace dynamics that we're talking about that were going on there, and also to the games that intelligence were playing with them. I'm fond of telling this story about a friend of mine who worked briefly for the Kennedys. And this is going back a long time now, and she had just got out of high school. So I think that this is maybe 20 years ago, something like that. And she told me this story years later. And what happened was she was working for them, taking care of their children. And, you know, they loved her. They had a long relationship with her and everything else. But during one of these things, when she was straightening the place up, one of their really incredible paintings came down. And she was trying to put it back, you know, up, and the back of it had become sliced, but the front of it was just fine. But out of the back of the painting had spilled these documents. And so I asked her about the documents, and she told me all about them. But the documents were documents of FBI surveillance of JFK that went on for years. And they were stuck behind this painting that was at the JFK residence way back then. And the other thing that was interesting that was there was a ticket to an impeachment from 1868. So this is something kind of interesting that was mixed in with that. But so she goes and she tells Ethel Kennedy, this painting fell down. I'm sorry, there were these things in there. She says, no problem about it. As a matter of fact, you can keep the ticket from the inauguration for the impeachment. It's actually a ticket to see President Johnson from the 60s get impeached. The 1860s, though. So I actually have that. I still have it. So, but just this idea that the Mar-a-Lago piece gets us into the document range as well. So Robert Kennedy has these documents that he takes with him, and then there are these tapes that are recorded and held there as a kind of insurance against these people. There's a deep piece, I think, in relation to those tapes, but for our purposes, we're just going to use it for the LBJ aspect. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep here tonight on the Female Targets X Series 141. We're taking a close look at Governor John Connally and LBJ, who are both in the motorcade. But interestingly enough, there was someone else in that motorcade with the Kennedys, and his name was I.B. Hale, and his two twin sons had broken into Judith Exner's apartment looking for something or planting a bug. And I'm going to give you Hirsch's version of what he thought they were doing there and the information that he had. Okay. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Are we covering Dorothy Kilgallen at all tonight?
Yeah. Oh, Kilgallen is interesting. She crisscrosses with all of the characters that are involved here, but I think because of her role in relation to Ruby, she sort of merits her own a solo piece. And a lot of information has come out about Kilgallen, but now they're trying to do a weird thing with Kilgallen. They're trying to support that whole mafia killed JFK thing with her story, which makes no sense. In fact, she was going to Jim Garrison with information about her interview with Jack Ruby. And if anything, Garrison was the last person who believed the mafia angle. He knew the Central Intelligence Agency was behind it, plus this thing. What else you got?
Charlotte Key says, Jackie hired French detectives after the assassination, and they decided LBJ was the guilty one.
Well, it's a little bit different, that story. What it is, she learned of a study like that took place, and it's true. They led the whole assassination back to LBJ, and a number of sources have. But what she did was she was the head of a very large book publishing company in New York City, and that book had a hard time getting published in America. And what she did is she published it. So she didn't so much hire them to do the study. They had already done it and come to this conclusion. But her, understanding the truth of the matter, decided this really needs to get aired. So she put herself behind it, which is kind of a big deal. And he was dead by that point. So maybe she felt, okay, I can do this. Let's get a couple of things on the record here since I mentioned Connally. So his daughter is killed by Robert Hale. Shotgun. It's ruled an accident, as I mentioned. She was 18 years old. She was pregnant. She was married to Hale. Hale had gone to high school with, and both he and his twin brother knew Lee Harvey Oswald. Hale's going to have a really weird life, too, because he's going to be one of these guys who first goes to New Mexico to start a hippie commune with Sunstar, his wife. And then he'll bring that commune to Alaska, and he'll attract all these followers, kind of like a mini Manson story. And then eventually all of these things will come up in relation to it, that he was abusive here. He sexually abused his own children. He beat his wife, all these weird things. The Hales are just a weird twist in all of this.
Is there any relation to any other famous Hales?
No, the ones I'm mentioning here are the crisscross on
Okay.
it. The LBJ... So LBJ's crony, John Connally, let's think of him that way. He's the Secretary of the Navy, and Fred Korth, his successor as Secretary of the Navy, is also an LBJ crony. This is interesting because they're both involved in advanced technology projects. and defense contractors who were doing those aerospace projects. His daughter is Verita. She's also the one who dies of a self-inflicted gunshot. It's pretty amazing. And, so we mentioned that whole piece there about them in the car and LBJ saying, no, I need you to be in the car with Yarborough and I need Connolly with me. So that didn't work out. And so they had really bad blood there. That's what we heard about. LBJ's mistress, who, Madeline Brown, who put a lot of this on the record later, she would say that he said, the Kennedys, they'll never make a fool of me again. Just wait and see what happens, So he was positioning himself and getting things ready. And he'd had enough of being marginalized, and he knew that the Kennedys were going to dump him. So we have a lot there with LBJ. If you look into LBJ's history, it's very clear that he's somebody who will kill for power. And he has his own hitman named Mac Wallace. And Mac Wallace, there's a whole history of him killing a Gulf pro who was dating his sister, Josepha Johnson. And then he shoots him. And the idea is that, basically she had loose lips and told him something about LBJ, and he didn't want this guy around. And so Malcolm Wallace is supposed to go to prison for life for shooting this golf pro. But they say, oh, it's in Texas and LBJ has all this power. And he's let off with basically a warning. Served time served. And Malcolm Wallace will come up again because
for murder.
Yes, exactly. That story, is a very strange one to go back. That's Texas law going on there. There was a lot of strings that were being pulled. And it's very interesting if you go back and look at the story, because Malcolm Wallace will get fingerprinted as the result of killing this Gulf pro. And what happens is in the Texas School Book Depository, there are these different researchers who wonder, there's one in particular who wonder, is this the same guy? There's an unidentified fingerprint on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And so what happens is he is, fingerprinted at that period. After 50 years, you can go get his fingerprints. So this guy did in 2003, and boom, he matched the fingerprints up. So there's a fingerprint of Mac Wallace at the Texas School Book Depository. Seeing that he's LBJ's hitman, it's pretty clear that LBJ is involved in the assassination. Now, of course, I don't think that any of the killing shots came from the depository, but he was able to create the distraction, the impression that Oswald was up there shooting. That seems to be what his role was. So again, around LBJ and around LBJ we go. All right, now let's take a quick look at what happened with Hale, and then depending on time here, I think we're going to jump to Mary Meyer. Yes. How are you doing over there?
Doing great.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, here's an interesting thing that ties in the Hale twins with Exner and potentially Marilyn. Marilyn also dies in Los Angeles. Marilyn died 2 days before Exner was broken into. Exner's also in Los Angeles, and the twins broke in there. They placed their bug and they took off. But let's suppose for a moment that the same Hale was behind looking for getting dirt on Kennedy, also wanted to break into Marilyn's place because he knew that they were having an affair. It's pretty close proximity. Why not break in there too and bug them? Well, that could have been part of the problem that was going on with Marilyn's death, which is they're caught in the act, or they decide, since she identifies them, that they can't leave her alive. The fact that these two incidents happen within 2 days of each other brings us right back into the Hale part in a big, major way, because Marilyn's death is so suspicious. And of course, we'll do an episode of Marilyn just on her own and her connection with Kennedy. I'm going to get into some of that tonight. But right now, I want to look at that piece with her. And the timing there is just too good, because Exner is a major target for them and getting this kind of blackmail. But Marilyn's right close by. And if these guys are operating in there and the FBI are watching them and not arresting them, 2 days later, they could easily be responsible for what happened with Marilyn. Think about it. That's something to put on the record. Let's go a little further with what happens to Hale. I mentioned that his life turned out very strangely. And I would say that Seymour Hersh, when he is investigating, trying to get in touch with them both, they have gone deep, deep underground, and they can't be really contacted. On August 7th, 1962, before living in Alaska, Hale and his twin brother, Billy Hale, were observed by an FBI agent as they burgled the Los Angeles apartment of Judith Exner, who later claimed to be a mistress of John F. Kennedy. Actually, the committee brought her up because they knew it, and she just let them know. She didn't go around claiming it. In 1974, by the way, there's an incredible trail of receipts and White House visits and all calls and all the rest of it with Exner. She's not somebody who just dreamed up. She just, she had this 1.5 year off again, on again relationship with President Kennedy. In 1974, Robert Hale, then going by the name Sunstar, kid you not, met 16-year-old Curina Ross Bresler in the California desert. She would later call herself Country Rose and bear Hale 15 children.
Oh.
Hale gained notoriety throughout his family's iconoclastic lifestyle. Self-proclaimed Christian, Hale moves his family of 17 to New Mexico and kept them isolated from nearly all outside influences, including churches. In 2002, Hale launched a legal battle with the National Park Service over his plan to bulldoze a road called Hillbilly Heaven. He lost his case and he appealed it to the Supreme Court. In 2005, family members told police that Hale had routinely beaten and raped his eldest daughter for years. He was incarcerated in September of 2007 and died 8 months later. Of course, Hale is mentioned in Seymour Hersh's book and his work. The tie-in here is quite fascinating because you have all of this stuff around Hale, but what is Hale? He's an executive of General Dynamics. If you go to the Ken Thomas work around General Dynamics, you find all the information about the TFX fighter and the experimental aerospace unmanned planes that they were developing. And then what do they end up doing with that whole program? They end up developing it at and creating Pine Gap, which is the Australian Area 51 that the Americans set up in the 60s. So we've got the aerospace UFO tie here throughout the General Dynamics piece. And we have Hale trying to get Kennedy to swing him the biggest contract in that entire era that had ever happened. So this gets us in the right headspace to look at, I think, what's going on. Now, here's an interesting thing about Hale's wife. All right. They go through in the Warren Commission all the different contacts and how did Oswald get a job in the Texas School Book Depository. The Texas School Book Depository, as I've mentioned, is owned by D.H. Byrd, Dryhold Byrd, who is the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who goes to Antarctica. But he's also someone who will invest heavily in a company called LTV, or Linco Vought. His own company, although he does oil, the company he is investing heavily with is this aerospace venture, and they have secret experimental planes. So the person who owns the Texas School Book Depository and who also created the Civil Air Patrol is somebody who's financing a secret project aerospace company. So when you show up there at the Texas School Book Depository hauling these books, if you're somebody who's connected with this whole program of aerospace, as we know Oswald was, because he brags about he's going to be working for NASA and all the rest. And he worked at Atsugi in Japan on the U-2, which is a very, highly secret project on the aerospace side. Well, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at Oswald walking into this Texas School Book Depository, and it's owned by D.H. Byrd, who's running a aerospace company. All right, now, Miss Virginia Hale gets questioned because she's one of the people that Oswald came to for a job. She's the wife of I.B. Hale, who's the General Dynamics contractor. Oswald actually meets her 4 times trying to get a job. On May 13th, 1964, Miss Virginia Hale Fort Worth, Texas, employed in the Job Placement Division of the Texas Employment Commission, Fort Worth, Texas, furnished the following information. She recalled Lee Harvey Oswald quite well. She sent him out on the job to the Leslie Wielding Company. Mrs. Hale stated she did not give the names of Max Clark to Oswald, but she believed that Annie Laura Smith from the Texas Employment Commission might have furnished the name of Clark to Oswald. It's this whole web that will take us to the Texas School Book Depository. It places Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository 6 weeks before the president will get there, but 2 weeks before anyone in the world knows that that's where they're going to be going. So they have to place him there first. It's very interesting when you get into that too. So now we have Hale, I.B. Hale, his wife knows Oswald, and his kids have gone to school with Oswald. And those twins are going to break into Kennedy's mistress's apartment, trying to plant something or steal something or whatever it happens to be, get some incriminating information to help blackmail the Kennedys. And that's all within 2 days of Marilyn Monroe dying in the same vicinity. So I think that we have an interesting location and group of people when we're getting into these very heavy stories. And again, aerospace looming over it dramatically. And the female targets, in this case, Judith Exner. We're going to get back to Judith Exner, but now I'm going to go to someone else who's in that vicinity of Los Angeles, Karen Kupcinet. Look, Karen Kupcinet is interesting for a couple of reasons. She'd been on the Andy Griffith Show. She'd done Little Shop of Horrors. She was a young 22-year-old actress who was up and coming in Hollywood. And she's from a Chicago family, right? Yes, that's what we're going to get into, because the Chicago piece is going to become quite important with this. So we remember Giancana's Chicago. He's the godfather of the Chicago mob. But is Chicago going to come up again? Heck yes, it is.
So a lot of people thought that was Natalie Wood in the thumbnail, but it is Karen Kupcinet.
It is indeed. Yeah, she does look like Wood. I agree, actually. And she has a Russian Jewish background. And so I think also Natalie Wood was Russian, wasn't she?
She's Russian. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Kupcinet's story is particularly interesting. And it's interesting because there's a researcher named Penn Jones who dug out a very unusual set of circumstances that came up around her. So as it turns out, someone back in November 22nd, 1963 had called the police, who then were connected up with the FBI, and said the president's going to be assassinated in a half hour. And it's going to happen. He's there in Dallas, and you need to stop it. And their conversation was wandering a little bit. They were definitely sounded out of it in that sense. Now, this is actually Penn Jones's account. Penn Jones was a great newspaper guy in Texas who tracked down the CIA LBJ links to the assassination and wrote a 4-volume series called Forgive My Grief, which is still remarkable and still, is one of those books, along with Paris Flamon's Assassination of America, which really set the tone on this. By the way, I'm still looking for the complete 4-volume set of Paris Flamon's Assassination of America, which I believe is the hardest set of books to find, period. I do have the Dallas part of it. I have the Dallas book and I have the index book. The other 2 books, Assassination of America and the New Orleans Masks, those 2 are simply the hardest books in the world to find. They have been completely wiped out of circulation.
They've been scrubbed. They've
just been scrubbed. And so I've been looking for them, and we'll pay real money for them. But if you run across them, if you have them, I know that in this period when they were published in 2005 to 2008 by Paris Flamand, a lot of people had them. As a matter of fact, they're listed on some of the, Kennedy's and King website has them. So we know that they were around, but Flamand's work turns out is very key and important. So if somebody has one of those books. Let's talk. Okay. Now, Karen Kupcinet. Let's go into this. This is Penn Jones from his book. This writer did not put the death of Karen Kupcinet on this list of strange deaths during the first 3 years of our investigation. While a guest on a TV show, The Koop Show, K-U-P, in Chicago, I did not mention her death with Irv Kupcinet, the star of the show and the father of Miss Kupcinet. Now, for the first time, we list her here as one of the strange deaths. Here's the interesting thing. Irv, her dad, was a big-time personality in the media in Chicago and had his own show called Irv, and everyone, even Robert Kennedy, big stars, politicians, everybody went on his show. There he is with old Blue Eyes over here. Now, Irv is in Chicago, and one of the interesting things in his bio that Penn Jones found out is that he was very close with another famous Chicago person named Jack Ruby. We know that Ruby is a very interesting player in all of this. Technically, he's known as the person who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, but we know there's a much deeper story with Ruby as well, and that he's deeply involved in all of these things, and that he knew Oswald beforehand and all the rest. The official story is just he was a distraught nightclub owner. Yeah, that was a good one. But let's see what Penn Jones had to say here. A few days before the assassination, Karen Kupcinet, 23, was trying to place a long-distance telephone call from the Los Angeles area. According to reports, the long-distance operator heard Miss Kupcinet scream into the telephone that President Kennedy was going to be killed. 2 days after the assassination, Miss Kupcinet was found murdered in her apartment. The case has never been solved. Yet another of the strange coincidences involved here. Kupcinet and Jack Ruby, Irv Kupcinet and Jack Ruby grew up and were acquainted with each other in the same neighborhood in Chicago. And remember, Ruby was deep in the mob action, the whole Al Capone machine, all that stuff, before he became the Dallas nightclub guy. We include the death of Miss Kupcinet now because she was the only person to scream that Kennedy was going to be killed before the event took place. A right-winger in Miami was telling an undercover policeman November 9th that the Kennedy was going to be killed and related many of the details of the plan also, but this is the only person who called and actually said it's happening. This is an Associated Press dispatch printed in the Chicago Daily News November 23rd, originating from Oxnard, California, which told approximately the same story we have. The story read, the telephone company executive said that 20 minutes before President Kennedy was assassinated, a woman caller was overheard whispering, "The president's going to be killed." Roy Sheehan, manager of the Oxnard division of the General Telephone Company, said the caller stumbled into our operator's circuits, perhaps by misdialing. Sheehan said the woman seemed to be a little bit disturbed, predicting the president's death. Sheehan said the call was reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Los Angeles, but not until after the president had been shot. Until then, he said it appeared to have just been a crank call, of course. The FBI in Los Angeles declined to comment. Sheehan said one telephone supervisor called another onto her line to verify what she was hearing. He said both supervisors heard the woman say the president would be killed in a half hour. Sheehan said the call was received at 10:10 a.m. Pacific time. The president was shot in Dallas shortly after 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. Sheehan said he doesn't think the caller was ever connected with another party. Now, interestingly enough, Kupcinet makes the call, and then, oddly enough, 4 days later, she's dead. Now, she was a promising actress, and her death takes on a very unusual spin of its own. As I said, she'd been on popular TV shows. She'd been in some musicals. She was up and coming. And she was very good friends with Mark Goddard and his girlfriend, who was an actress. And Goddard, he ends up on Lost in Space. And, he ends up doing a lot of work in the 60s. But what happens is, because they know her and because they were the last people to see her, they have to take lie detector tests to prove that they didn't kill her. And what happens is they tell the story of talking with her that night, and that she had been, since the Kennedy assassination, acting very strangely. She couldn't complete a sentence. She couldn't finish her food. And they asked her that night, they were like, look, it's been a few days of this. What's going on with you? What's the problem? And she said, someone left a baby on my doorstep. So after the assassination and after she dies, they go through all the police records and no one left a baby on her doorstep. So she's basically giving them some kind of a line to say, this is why I'm acting so weird. But in fact, it's because, it may be because somehow through that connection of her dad, Irv, and his relationship with Ruby, he learned of the assassination and somehow she learned about it through him. And then she tries to tell the FBI. They don't believe her. And then because it gets tracked back that somebody tried to blab this, they figure it out and bump her off a few days later. The story is a strange one. She's strangled and she's left nude on her couch. Now, when Mark Goddard and the girlfriend left her, she was watching the TV lowly, the low volume, and she was passed out, but she had all her clothes on. 3 days later, when they go back, she's there, she's nude, but the TV's still on. So,
did they ascertain time of death?
Well, there is a report here actually on her death, and it says actress Karen Kupcinet was found dead last night, lying nude on a living room couch. Detectives said at first they believed she was murdered. They later said that they were not sure how she met her death. She was the daughter of Chicago columnist Irv Kupcinet. Her body was found lying on its side with flecks of blood on her face and a pillow. A television set nearby was playing. There were no notes nor indications of suicide. Later, this is what's interesting about this story. When there was this confusion about the nature of her death, there was this, there are two weird things in relation to her case that are very unusual. One is that she typed up what seemed like a suicide note. Later, they were like, oh yeah, it was all about her body image and all this stuff. And, but they didn't find it initially. They found it later. So that was weird. But then the coroner came back and said, no, that's not a suicide note. Someone strangled her. This is how it worked. So actor Mark Goddard, 27, and his wife Marcia said Miss Kupcinet had been at their home last Wednesday evening and that they had tried to phone her yesterday. On checking her answering service, they found she had not checked with it recently, and they told police they went to her apartment, found the door unlocked, and discovered the actress on the sofa. They said the television set sound was turned down, a bowl of cigarettes and a coffee pot were knocked to the floor, and a lamp was turned over. She was a vibrant young kid, said Jerry Lewis, informed of the news. She had a great dramatic future. I've known her since she was a baby. Her father and I are very fast friends. I've got to call him. Now, Miss Kupcinet was born in Chicago and attended Wellesley, where she once told an interviewer, I was Miss 5x5, and so on they go. That story is very interesting for a lot of reasons. And the Jerry Lewis thing, I think, tells us just the length of the connections that were going on here out of Chicago.
Lewis is from Chicago.
Lewis is from Chicago. Ruby's from Chicago. And Irv is from Chicago. They're all Jewish. Mm-hmm. And just like we have Sinatra with the Italian mafia working with Giancana, there is a Jewish mafia piece that comes out of Chicago. And so we have all these pieces interacting with each other, and then there she is in Hollywood.
Right, and you've got Jerry Lewis and Frank Sinatra connected.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Traveling Riverside Blues Johnson wanted to mention that Marilyn was also found in the nude.
That's true. The only other weird thing I can say about this case is she was going out with, I told you the actor's name. Do you remember?
It's Andrew Prine.
Andrew Prine.
Who is in the series V
yes.
as the head alien.
Exactly. Now, Andrew is very interesting for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that happened with him was they instantly thought that he was a suspect because they had had all these fights. And he said, no, interestingly enough, she had sent me this letter that she got, and it looked just like one of those threat letters from the Black Dahlia killing, with the cutout letters from newspapers and stacked together. and then pasted on a piece of paper and left for her. And she said, I've been getting these weird threats. This was right the day after the assassination. So then he got his own. Andrew Prine got his own weird cutout threat letter too. Maybe whoever it was thought she told him. And then later the police said, oh no, she must have done that herself to get attention. And that's how they left the case. It's a problem. That particular murder case is a big problem. There's no suspects. All the suspects that were involved took lie detector tests. And she, from being somebody with a very steady, upbeat personality, 22-year-old actress with everything in the world to live for, starts acting weird for 3 or 4 days and can't eat and makes this weird call about the JFK assassination, and then she turns up dead. So the Kupcinet case gets us into that Ruby arena. And Irv, when he's questioned about the JFK part later, 20 years later, he says, oh no, that's ridiculous, and I never suspected Andrew Prine of killing her, but I have someone in mind who might have done it. And he just leaves it there, and he never goes forward with it. What's interesting is both Jerry Lewis and Irv do the telethons. They both are doing the muscular dystrophy telethons. So that's an interesting kind of connection that they both have. But it's a weird story. When we go into the next piece of female targets, maybe some of these threads will crisscross. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 141 female targets. And we've taken a pretty deep dive on this one. Now, I want to take your questions. So what we'll do is I'll do the rest of what I have. I'll put it into 15 minutes, and then we'll take the last hour with your calls, with your questions. And I'm also, I probably am going to do another female targets piece with this, probably with Dorothy and Marilyn. So, we'll keep that whole piece open. But I would say, as far as it goes, something like Kupcinet, it's not given enough attention, probably because of her level of, she hadn't achieved that fame yet. But if we're looking at the thread of Exner and Kupcinet and Marilyn, and even John Connolly's daughter, there's a weird thread that all of these things are around the Kennedy assassination. And that's something that I think we need to be looking at. Yes.
Yeah. Charlotte Key says she was targeted. Leaving murder victims nude is some modus operandi of some dreary secret society thing. They must add insult to injury. And it reminds me also that Robert Maxwell, when he was murdered, was nude also.
That's true.
It's some symbolism there.
Yeah. Yeah. When he supposedly jumped off the boat nude, that was it. I definitely, when we go back and we look at Exner and we think about Old Blue Eyes with Giancana also, I think that one of the reasons, although her life was destroyed, one of the reasons she wasn't killed was because she had that level of protection. And I think that that's important. Yes.
Okay, one last thing. Brendan Fisher says, wasn't the CIA keeper of the X-File in Chicago at that time also?
The CIA keeper
it's
of
actually
the X-File.
FBI.
You mean Guy Bannister?
Guy Bannister.
Yeah, well,
he's from Chicago.
He was FBI in Chicago, but the whole Irv Ruby period, he also was a Chicago link. Absolutely.
But he was in New Orleans later.
He was in New Orleans during the Oswald period. So he's in New Orleans from the late 50s through the early 60s. He dies mysteriously when the Warren Commission comes out, just like the next person we're going to talk about here, Mary Meyer. But that is a really good point. The Chicago piece is just undeniable. Let's look a little bit at Mary Meyer. Let's see if we can fit this all in. Mary Meyer is somebody who was well acquainted with JFK for years, knew him for like a decade, and was part of that whole Georgetown upper crust scene, not the Hollywood deal at all. She was more of the kind of Ivy League group. But she's a very interesting woman. She's an artist, and she was very advanced politically. And one of the people she crisscrossed with early on was Timothy Leary. and she became somebody, he was sort of like a guru for her, and he was very into LSD. And this is something that comes up with her and her relationship with Kennedy, is that she wanted to get Kennedy to try LSD. And there are a lot of stories about him doing that, but I think it's more in the realm of something that she wanted him to do. But she knew him so well, and she said that his whole vision for the future was about peace and how it could be achieved. And this is the thing that he labored on and talked, historically and all the rest of it. Now, here's the weird thing about Mary. Her husband is a CIA agent named Cord Meyer. And when she separates and eventually divorces him, she sees President Kennedy. So they have a relationship. I'm going to give a little setup on this, though, because I think we need to keep threading in the aerospace piece in order for us to understand it. So both these cases that we've been looking at, like Exner, all have that aerospace thread, because the defense contracting piece, this defense contractor Hale breaking into her apartment. Now, this is Garrison, who investigated the JFK assassination, writing a note to the editor of Ramparts magazine. This is our foundational piece for why they won't release the JFK records on Garrison, because it will expose the aerospace aspect. Those records are supposed to come out on December 15th. They're the CIA records of the Garrison trial, George Joanetti's, and a few other kind of hot potatoes. Those are 15,000 files of documents, and you can imagine how many documents are in the files. So, there's a huge range there. And there was a push, I mentioned this at the top of the show, with Jefferson Morley and the Mary Farrell Foundation trying to get these out. And one of the weird things that came out was all these news stories saying there's new files that came out through this Mary Farrell Foundation lawsuit. No, no files came out. There has been no, they just launched the legal suit, and the Biden administration hasn't done anything with it. So I don't know where those news stories were saying that. I think that they just wanted a headline or something, or they haven't looked into it deeply enough. But no, the Mary Farrell Foundation has not got any documents, and Jefferson Morley didn't show any documents, as a matter of fact, during his presentation that were new. He just said, we have the George Joanetti's piece. That's what they're keeping back there. And it was him going through his very solid background on what had happened. And basically, in a nutshell, George Joanetti's was the top psychological warfare operations officer in the government for the CIA. He's the one who created the Oswald Project. And the whole piece of the CIA using Oswald to try to drum up attention in New Orleans before he was, so he could look like a communist before they make him the assassin, so that when he's outed as an assassin during these press conferences, and they're like, this is the guy who did it, they go back and they say, look, last summer he was making all this trouble and saying he was a Marxist on TV, and they show the clip. So that whole thing was masterminded by Joanetti's, and until Morley's work, we never even knew Joanetti's was out there because he was so well hidden. But here's the interesting thing. This agent who was involved in creating the Oswald Project is the same person who acted as the liaison for all the major Kennedy investigations in the 1970s. So he's the CIA man feeding out the records to those people. He's the guy who was in charge of the project of creating Oswald. So, we can see there were a lot of problems involved with that, because if, he's the person who created the project and he's the liaison for the CIA saying, here's our records and our transparency, obviously he has a lot to hide. So those files are the files that are hidden, and the Mary Farrell Foundation is suing the Biden administration for those files because they're supposed to be out by law. So this is the crux of that. All the headlines and all the weirdness that Newsweek said, well, these new documents show CIA linked with Oswald and all that stuff. Nothing came out. It was just, he gave a presentation that he wanted the CIA to release those files on the 15th. So there's a weird buzz there in those stories. And I wondered if it wasn't a pump up of a balloon in order to pop it on the 15th and just say, you got no files. All right. So let's go back to 1968. 67. And we're going to have Jim Garrison is the DA of New Orleans, and he is investigating the Kennedy assassination. Oliver Stone made this story about his life, and the movie was very successful in 1991. That's what got the JFK Records Act going, because of the public outrage of the whole thing. And it's a great movie, and it comes directly out of Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassins. You can literally find almost every scene in the book. One thing that I want to point out is that Garrison is uncomfortable when he runs into certain things. He doesn't know what to make of them. One of them is all of the aerospace connections around the assassination. Finally, he makes a call to the Rampart's editor, Ned Hinkle. And Ned Hinkle will word for word give this explanation later. This is what Hinkle said. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. This is risky, but I have little choice. It's imperative that I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oil men do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way that we first thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination. But as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. That's what Garrison had come to. That's why the Garrison records will never come out. He had figured out that what had gone on in the Kennedy assassination wasn't Cubans, wasn't mafia and all the rest of it. It was the aerospace wing that had assassinated him over this exotic technology. And that's the technology that I'm suggesting is directly the X technology inside the UFO file. That's the nature of the problem. The Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, put on record on this show. I put it out there many times. But he put it out there that E. Howard Hunt, the top super spy for the United States, his friend in private told him that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. So this is a very key, crucial piece, because when you get around all the weirdness and the female target deaths around the JFK assassination, they're all related in some way or fashion with the aerospace industry. And there's a weird piece there, because he asks Ned Hinkle, do you have a pencil? And Hinkle says, I wrote down the names of the 3 defense contractors Garrison identified. He said they were Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics. There it is, General Dynamics sitting right in the middle of it. And there's our whole piece about why the twins, and the twins are weird too. You know, if they knew Oswald and they were twins, did they have some way of imitating Oswald? And is that part of what they were used for? You know, now it starts to make sense. Here is Garrison identifying General Dynamics as being directly involved along with Boeing in the murder of President Kennedy. So what's missing whenever we get around the JFK assassination piece is the aerospace responsibility and the defense contractor role. And right in the middle of that corridor between aerospace, defense contractors, and intelligence is the X-Protect group that we've highlighted on this program in relation to the UFO file. The female targets, whenever they got in the middle of all this, they're dealing with the same people. Who is breaking into Judith Exner's place? General Dynamics people. You know, in the case of Marilyn, we have her, part of the FBI surveillance on her is that, you know, she's heard things about President Kennedy talking about UFOs at a secret airbase. It all goes back to this secret. And this is the nature of the problem when we get around this, that the aerospace piece isn't included, it's left out. And so you're always left with, oh, you know, did the mafia do it or something like that? That's where the CIA has let the story go, because they don't want you to get close to that piece, because the CIA deep state piece that includes the aerospace part, that's X-Protect. And they're involved with the exotic technology, the UFO file, and that piece. And that is what President Kennedy was getting at. And so when he's asking the CIA director to share all the UFO files that are high threat cases with the Russians on November 12th, 10 days before he's assassinated, when he joins in a joint moon mission instead of a space race with Nikita Khrushchev, and those records are at the JFK library, cooperation with the Soviet Union in outer space, the name of the document. You know, and Nikita Khrushchev's son comes forward and says, yeah, you know, they were going to go to space together. They undercut this whole thing. Well, that's a problem for the deep state people who want all these wars and also want to keep the UFO file to themselves and don't want to share it with other countries. Other countries have their own UFO file, and I think where Kennedy was going, again, with a broad stroke of a future vision, is we can share this information. I actually have a quote here from the speech that Gorbachev gave at the Texas School Book Depository. All right.
What year is this?
This is in 2012. I've long been interested in the life of John F. Kennedy. He was certainly a great president of the United States. For us who live in a complicated time of transition, of great importance is the vision of John F. Kennedy, his thoughts about peace and about how to live in this world. President Kennedy's remarks on June 10th, 1963 at American University are of even greater importance today than they were then. That's the famous speech where Kennedy says, you know, what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, you know, forced on the world by American weapons of war, but something where all nations get together for peace. And then he says we can't afford to have a nuclear war where even the fruits of victory will be ashes in our mouths. It's basically the best speech by an American president ever. President Kennedy's remarks on June 10th, 1963 at American University are of even greater importance today than then. 35 years ago, he already saw what we have come to understand only now. The best memory of this man would be to understand his deeds and thoughts and to translate them into policies, and more important, in the life of nations. He looked far ahead and he wanted to change a great deal. Perhaps it is this that is the key to the mystery of the death of President John F. Kennedy. That's a big deal for Gorbachev to put on the record. And it's interesting the amount of trips that he took to the Kennedy Library and also the amount of times he met with John Jr. and Jackie. There's something about what he knew in relation to the investigation and who was involved. And with that, I've got more, Miss Olivia, but with that, I'm going to go to your questions because we're at that 2 hour.
Okay. Timothy guessing. Why did James Jesus Angleton break into Mary Meyer's house? Diary?
Yes, that's a really good point, and that does go to the Mary Meyer part. So you've given me an entree right there. I've got a great picture here. You'll love this one. Just before we go there, a breaking felony arrest warrant has been issued for Biden energy official Sam Brinton for allegedly stealing luggage from the Las Vegas airport this time. It's a second round. On top of this criminal charges, he faces for a similar incident in the Minneapolis airport. There he is. Now, this would be a funny story, except he's a nuclear official in the Biden administration. Do you realize Stepford Biden and the danger that that administration represents with the people they're putting forward? There's our friend.
Oh, no.
He looks like, you know, he has his own band, and that's, you know, that's it. Here's a couple
He
of
went
things.
to MIT.
That's even scarier
I
somehow.
know.
Unbelievable. And you know, like the luggage stealing aspect of this is very interesting. It shows the psychopathy that's involved. The weird crimes are always the strangest. Okay. Here's a couple of things about Meyer, since you brought her up, and rightfully so. Mary Meyer, who I was mentioning, was close with Timothy Leary and also very close with Kennedy as a friend who he respected for her worldview, because she was very worldly like he was. Now, they had a relationship, and she was divorced from her husband, Cord Meyer, but Cord Meyer was a CIA agent. And later, E. Howard Hunt would identify Cord Meyer as one of the people involved with LBJ working out the CIA plans to remove President Kennedy. Cord Meyer himself, at the end of his life, in an old age home, would talk to a reporter and say the same SOBs who killed President Kennedy killed Mary. So that's interesting. Of course, there's a book out there, Mary's Mosaic, by Peter Janney, which, you know, it's these family of CIA people, and it's well known in CIA circles that the CIA assassinated Kennedy, and then also that Mary was killed as a result of this. And that Cord Meyer was in a position where, because she was uncovering details about the assassination that weren't supposed to be made public, she had an incredible inside track, and that Cord Meyer actually knew that they were going to assassinate her and didn't do anything about it, his former wife. So that's pretty heavy duty. But what happens is, and I have a picture of it here, there's a couple of things about Meyer. One is that Ben Bradley is her brother-in-law, and Ben Bradley is the top guy at the Washington Post, incredibly influential during that period. That's a shot of Mary there. Let's see if I get this one. Can you get me that one?
Sure.
So Mary actually knows him, like I said, for over a decade, and they share a number of things. And she is very interested in the world vision and says, you know, there's this thing called LSD, and if all the world leaders took it, I think that we could get peace going. And she recounts these peace conversations with Kennedy, and Leary says that, you know, she knew an important man who wanted to take it. But that's as far as the story goes. We don't know if President Kennedy ever tripped with Mary Meyer, although it raises a certain level of questions in relation to it. But it shows us where his thinking was going. So what happens is her sister Toni is the wife of Ben Bradley, and they do everything together, you know. And so then they get the terrible news that while she's out jogging, she has been shot in the morning close to her Georgetown home. And it's a very safe neighborhood, so it strikes them both as very strange. And the sister knows that she's looking into the Kennedy assassination. So instantly they have some problems, and they go to her house because they're aware that she kept a diary, and they want to know if it's still there. Somehow the sister knows that she keeps a very exact diary of everything that's going on. And they go to the house, and they're confronted by Jesus James Angleton, who is the top CIA. He's not the director, but he is basically a major coordinator for the CIA. So Mary died when she was jogging, and this is right after the Warren Commission report came out. She knew it was bunk, and she knew that he had been assassinated. And if Cord Meyer was involved, and that was her ex-husband, she may have been planning to out him and the whole thing. So she had to be eliminated. It was blamed on a hobo named Crump. And what happened was, a year and a half later, the case was thrown out because they had no evidence against the guy. He was just somebody who was wandering along the riverbank, and he didn't have a gun. So that whole story and her death, you know, really brings a lot of this forward, which is she understood the dynamics in the world that he was operating in. And he was very clear that he wanted this larger peace vision for the world. And she knew that. And she was thinking, when he was killed, according to her friends, everything that she said was they killed him because he was changing too fast. He was building a world peace mission, and they wanted exactly the opposite. And as someone who is the wife of a high-level CIA agent, Cord Meyer, she would know. This is a picture of Ben Bradley and his wife, Toni, who is Mary's sister, along with the Kennedys. And they're just hanging out there, the best of friends for many years. So it's a tragic ending for Mary Meyer, and, you know, again, directly associated to the Kennedys' assassination. A lot of these people were deemed threats. And so anyone who had any information or any pieces, that's why you see those lists of deaths anywhere associated. And if you would look at it, it would be very confusing, because the death lists, on one hand, are witnesses to the assassination, the first round. Then the second round, there are a lot of underworld deaths like Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana and all the rest. And then in the 1990s, with the ARRB, there are triple agent deaths associated with this, like Richard Nagel, for example. So, you know, what it is they compartmentalized the groups that were involved, and they eliminated them as they got their turn, as it were, because we know the Warren Commission never pursued any organized crime links, which was ridiculous because Jack Ruby that's all he did. There's a piece about Jack Ruby that's in JFK and the Unspeakable, and JFK and the Unspeakable is one of those books that does a really good job on the Kennedy assassination in taking in the deeper elements. And the part that really I think is fascinating is that Ruby's never explored properly. Ruby had incredible underworld connections. He had incredible hot zone connections. He spent most of his time running guns into the hot zone, particularly Cuba. And he was large in the Chicago mob. Nixon used him as an informant for drug running in Chicago. So when we look at that, we can see that he was never been explored properly, and they just are obsessed with, oh, he was a nightclub guy and maybe he was in the mafia. Instead of, no, he was in the mafia his whole life. He was also an informant. Nixon was freaked out when he saw him on TV. Roger Stone told me that right on this show. So the whole story around Ruby is, very unusual, but he's identified as one of these DISC people, Defense Industrial Security Command people, in the Torbett documents. So Ruby, again, there's that whole aspect, as it were. But there was an interesting quote here. Yeah, okay. So nightclub owner Jack Ruby came to murder Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days after President Kennedy's assassination. Jack Ruby's first known involvement with the Central Intelligence Agency came up in the late 1950s when he was smuggling guns from Florida to Texas to a young Cuban revolutionary, Fidel Castro, because they wanted to play both sides with it. This guy, we'll give him guns, and then if he turns against us, we'll supply the anti-groups. And so skipping ahead, the CIA monitored the shipments. According to gun smugglers and CIA operative Edward Broder, during the pre-Castro government years, the CIA and Customs would not oppose gun shipments to Castro. After Castro turned communist, the CIA and the Customs encouraged shipments to anti-Castro forces. Ruby was no more in sympathy with Castro's cause than were his sponsors and monitors. As a friend of his put it, he was in it for the money. It didn't matter what side, just one that would pay him the most. In 1957, Ruby commuted between Dallas and the Houston suburb of Kemah on Galveston Bay. In Kemah, according to his poker-playing friend, card dealer James Beard, Ruby stored guns and ammo in a 2-story house near the waterfront. Beard saw Ruby and his associates load many boxes of new guns, including automatic rifles and handguns. After Castro overthrew Batista, this is when Castro gets in. This is January of 1959. The easily bought Ruby began to provide weapons, now with CIA support, to anti-Castro Cubans. Ruby was working with another CIA-connected gunrunner, Thomas Eli Davis. It was an association that would later haunt him. When Ruby was preparing for his trial for killing Oswald, it was the name of Davis that he feared might be brought up by the prosecution. He told his first attorney, Tom Howard, that he had been involved with Davis, who was a gun runner entangled in anti-Castro efforts. So the CIA had used Ruby for years, running guns and all the rest of it, especially in the hot zone. Nixon had used him in Chicago as part of a Washington committee as an informant for a drug piece. And he was involved with the Al Capone mafia machine out of Chicago, and Giancana's out of Chicago. So Ruby is part of that. Again, it is he's not an incidental character, and it's easy when they create the subplots for the JFK thing to just be like, well, they're anti-Castro people and mafia, those are the associations. But if you really look at the overarching piece, it is that the Central Intelligence Agency is controlling the players on the ground, and the most telling piece is the aerospace aspect in relation to the Central Intelligence Agency. That's where they have the most to hide. Yes.
Are you ready for questions?
Sure.
Okay, let's start with David Tormina. DJ, if those JFK files implicate Boeing in a serious way, Could the fear of that company and other aerospace companies collapsing be enough for Trump to be afraid to release said files?
Well, I think what you have to do when you look at the files is think to yourself, what would it be? What would the aspect be? And what they've always put forward is that, the reason they couldn't release them is because it would out certain agents and things like that. And we all know that all the agents are dead who were involved, and some of the countries don't even exist. So you have to start to put things like the defense contractors out there as part of what this is all about. For me, though, it wouldn't be a private company that would be the nature of the problem for the Central Intelligence Agency. It would be the revelation that someone, basically who was involved in the assassination has a direct connection to aerospace, because that's the thing that comes out of it. If they let out the aerospace piece, then they have to open up. It opens up too many things that they've kept down so well that people don't even really question it. As I've said, although there have been some people who threaded together that there was a JFK UFO issue, nobody quite has put it out as the JFK aerospace threads. And the only reason I've been able to do it is that the aerospace aspect represents the exotic technology. If you go into the work of Dr. Farrell, for example, you can learn about what they do around the exotic technology piece in order to shepherd that and keep it secret. So, in work like the Giza Death Star work, you can find it. In the larger deep state work around the assassination, you'll find defense contractors, but you won't find the direct reference to aerospace as a problem for this being involved. You're going to look more at, CIA contracts, defense contractors in terms of money, and you're going to look at things like, there was this anti-Castro leader who wanted to, be a big shot, and he was running, Oswald when he was in Dallas, and things of this nature. Or there's this Miami, mafia figure, and he had a big role in setting up such and such and hiring such and such an assassin. This is the nature of why the deep state research around the JFK assassination also goes off a cliff, because if you don't include the UFO exotic technology part, then you're going to miss all of the connections with it. The only place where you can really find it put together, and it's old now, that's the Torbit document, but it gives you, and it doesn't have all the threads, but it gives you enough of the threads of the secret space program and DISC that you can start to put together the threads of the Defense Industrial Security Command, who's involved with it. And that is where the whole Nazi NASA piece comes into play. Because if you have NASA and you have von Braun and this whole piece, I have a thing on von Braun that I saved especially for tonight that fits in with all this, oddly enough. But what I think is interesting is JFK is right in the heart of pushing the moon program. He's right in the heart of the UFO file. He is, this is where the things that originate against him come from, because this is where he's changing things. And I think, there's a number of areas that he's working in where he's opposed the Federal Reserve and other places. And his general track on the world is very different. And you see that they're involving assassination programs. They try to remove de Gaulle just before Kennedy is assassinated. They do assassinate the Diem brothers in Vietnam, to the horror of JFK, only 3 weeks before he's assassinated. They're already moving on their program. And so the assassination piece needs to be understood, but you can't get the whole picture if you don't have the aerospace piece involved. And that's, I think, a crucial aspect. Yes.
Wendy Eater, does JFK's death over the UFO file include a cover-up of alternative energy and or anti-gravity?
Well, think about JFK for a moment. Here's somebody who wants to basically move the culture. Right. And so he's not interested in monopolies around oil and things of this nature. Uh, and he is a solutions person. He's a freedom person. He wants to, get everyone on the same level. One of his main quotes was, "A rising tide lifts all boats." So think about it in terms of energy. How long before the Kennedy leadership, the Kennedy White House gets into an alternative form of energy, so that things like you get in the 1970s, like the incredible energy crisis and things like that, the Kennedys at the helm would have been a very different situation. For one, we wouldn't have been spending all our money on the Vietnam War. And that's major, but the whole vision about opening government up. This is interesting because, it's interesting that Gorbachev is such an admirer of JFK, because what did he do in the Soviet Union? Glasnost. He did a new open policy. Nobody had done anything like that in Russia ever. So, we see that his vision for the world influenced other leaders, and I think they were afraid of that too. Because I think the people who control the deep state aspect, I think we can refer to that here. The deep state aspect in relation to aerospace would be the X-Protect group, and that is the UFO file. I go for that because I know that it's highlighted as the top secret of the United States government. So if it's set in the 1950s on a higher secrecy level than our atomic energy program, what is the nature of what you're talking about there? And there's no structure that we understand that handles it. Even the things that came out about MJ12 and all the rest of it, a scientific body that would handle it. But there are other pieces of it. Who holds the material? What are the rules around the material? What have been the advances around the material? What are the commercial impacts of material like this? There's so much involved with that if Kennedy blows the whistle on it, and if he is sharing the UFO file, then that's basically the end of the whole advantage that they're developing. And for me, that's two different levels of government there. So yeah, we'd be living in an entirely different setup if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated. It literally moves everything on an entirely different track. Yes.
Pontos Fathom Press. Is that possible energy weapon that fried Dr. Mary Sherman part of this?
Well, that's very interesting too. And Sherman comes in also because, we have the whole, she comes into the Kennedy story because the girlfriend of Lee Harvey Oswald, Judy Baker, mentions her. And I interviewed Judy. And you can take her story or leave it. I don't think you need to believe her in order to understand this part. But all she basically said was that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with the medical and biological weapon program, and that he was a courier of materials, basically. That's how they used him. And that the people involved, Dr. Oshner and Mary Sherman, were developing a bioweapon to kill Castro. We know that programs like this existed, and they were setting them up to eliminate leaders. That's what the CIA does. In that period, they were on overdrive. And so Mary Sherman, her death is very unusual because she supposedly died in a house fire, but in fact, her arm had been obliterated. And it was learned later that there was basically a version of CERN that was there in New Orleans that she had access to and had visited. And it would make more sense for this atom smasher thing to have taken place in relation to this. And also there's a connection with David Ferrie and that atom smasher. So the CERN style technology, maybe that's something that they needed to move off the soil of the United States, although we certainly have enough of those here. Yes. But the main one, as we know, is the hardcore Hadron Collider in Switzerland.
Okay, Steve Hess, LBJ narrative versus UFO narrative in the assassination. Can you explain further?
Yeah, well, LBJ was known as Senator NASA. And he was known to kiss up to Harry Byrd, who handled all the purse strings for aerospace projects in the Senate. So he's also very close friends with von Braun. So LBJ positions himself perfectly, and they move, all the plans for NASA, like the Houston Space Center and all that stuff, were supposed to be here in Cambridge. 8 minutes, basically, or probably even less, more like 5-minute walk from here is exactly where they were supposed to set up the Kennedy Space Center. And this is the nature of the thing. They were going to have it here. And it is through LBJ's influence, the Byrd's influence, that they moved all that material and all that setup to Texas. That's even why it's there. And if you think about that, Texas is fantastic. And it's a great location for any of this. And Florida is a great location as well. But think about Kennedy's role in the space program. And isn't it strange that Boston doesn't have anything associated with NASA and the space program?
Yet.
I mean,
well, because it's exploding with biotech now.
Oh, there's no question. And it's a center for so many things. But think about it. I mean, President Kennedy died in 1963, and they never had any space rocket launch things here. It's just the occasional astrophysics lab. That's a little bit interesting. And I think that's part of it, is the power center moved down there to Texas. Yes.
Neil Bauman, does the Bush family have any ties to aerospace money or just oil? And Mitakwe Oyasin says the Bush family banking and intelligence.
Well, yeah, there's so much with the Bushes and, the Bushes around the Kennedy case as well. Bush had all kinds of connections with aerospace. He had a Mars mission set up so that we would reach Mars by 2025. And he and Quayle did that. There's always a famous clip that they show of Quayle where Lloyd Benson says, "I knew Jack Kennedy. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." But if you go and rewind it just by a minute, you'll hear that what Quayle is talking about is a space program.
Wow.
And how he's going to be the director of the new space program. This is another thing that's weird. Kennedy, when he's talking about space and all the things that are going to happen, he says, by 1990, everything is going to be different. And I know we're going to have a totally, 1990 will launch the new space program. What is that? What was he talking about there? So when someone earlier mentioned, was he suggesting alternative energy in relation to this? He's talking about by 1990, there'll be a totally different space program. That one just hangs out there in history as well. We don't know what it is, but that's the period where Bush and Quayle were in there. And they were like, let's set up the Space Council. Fantastic. We're going to do it. We're going to go to Mars in 2025. And Quayle's the head of the Space Council. The Space Council hangs around, but then nobody does anything with it. Clinton doesn't do anything with it. And then Bush W doesn't do anything with it. And then what happens? Obama says, hey, I'm going back and getting the Bush-Quayle Space Council and bringing it back to life, baby. And he doesn't do anything with it. As a matter of fact, his entire program, it's amazing about Obama because, there were so many misinformation pieces about Obama. He closed down government. He did not allow, FOIA requests on the level and the openness and the transparency that they did in the 70s and 80s. He was totally closed on it. He didn't try to move the culture forward with any particular program. And, this is somebody who wanted to prosecute reporters for the first time in history using the Espionage Act of 1917. So the Obama era is one of the most backward, misunderstood eras ever. And one thing I can say for Obama is that when the world economy collapsed, we had the opportunity to see the money powers for the corruption that they had. He got into office and he rehired all the same people who had caused the problem in the first place. So that gives you an idea about Obama. So Obama was basically the clerk for the bankers. But it's interesting because if you get out of the Obama era and you get into Trump's era, what happens? Suddenly, it's the space thing again. And it's Space Force this time. And the only problem that I think going on with this is when you get Trump involved, on that level, one of the good things that he's doing is he's trying to pull the UFO file back under presidential control. The only problem is, in order to do that, he has to call space a warfighting domain, which is the opposite of what President Kennedy set up. And that has to be remembered because all of the defense contractors are going to turn space into a warfighting domain. They already are in the process of this. They're taking our money to do it. The original program that the Nazis built was, when they wanted to do a rocket program, they said, we'll control the world from space. So that's a Nazi program. And the whole idea that Kennedy was doing was rerouting it and saying, look, space should be about peace, no weapons in space. Let's all agree on that up front. That's where he was coming from. And he had known war. He'd been through war, and he'd almost been in the middle of a nuclear war. He saved the world from nuclear war. So he was the person, when he set up the space program, the first rule, we're not going to bring weapons into space. Who could disagree with that? Maniacs in the the deep state and the defense corridor and all the money and power that flows from that. And these are the same transhumanist types who they want control, and they want that pulse over everything, and they want you chipped. And, so this is a long process of scientific indoctrination. And it's definitely happens through the military. Yes.
Mr. Monocle, did JFK know about Project Montauk? Does that fall under the X-Protect umbrella?
Well, that actual project, I believe, happened later. And he certainly was into particle collider. He was trying to get scientific experiments up to par, and he was also trying to completely superstart our space program to the point where he promised a lot that could be hard to deliver in putting a man in space and returning him safely to Earth within that decade. That was a lot they never anticipated having to do that. And so we have to look at it, from a few different perspectives on that. What I think that he was getting at was, there's a famous story about him, and after he has fired Alan Dulles, that he looks into a lot of records around Alan Dulles, and he finds out that Dulles was operating with sex slaves. So part of his operation, and he wanted to make sure that the successor, the person who took over CIA, wasn't, involved in human trafficking the way that Dulles was. So he's basically a huge, cleaning up the government aspect. He's like the sheriff is in town, but his vision for these things is totally different. And I think that we had got into a position after World War II where we were overconfident, one, and two, where you had to be kind of very military minded because you were coming out of such an incredible military period, but then they didn't know how to let it go. So the Joint Chiefs, the COG program, all these things are super dominant, constitution flouting programs, and the invention of the CIA is front and center in the middle of that because, there's a lot of traditional reasons for them to create the CIA, but one of the main reasons, in my opinion, was all the UFO activity. I don't think there's any question about it.
Okay. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, do you think the mob was running Maryland to pad their control file? And was Campbell also used by the CIA to pad the control file?
There's a lot of weirdness around Exner, and there's FBI harassment, and there's CIA surveillance, to the point where it was very hard for her to go anywhere and do anything or have any kind of normal life. And they wanted it that way as well. Hoover, who was the FBI director, was so obsessed with Kennedy's sex life that all he wanted to do was follow Exner around in the hope that Kennedy would get involved with her and he could listen in. And, this goes to his own perversion, but his own ability to manipulate as well. And Kennedy found out that they had been bugged because Hoover has the audacity to actually go into the Oval Office and say, this woman, that you're having this affair with, she's also involved with Sam Giancana. And he knows that Kennedy already knows that, but he's putting it across to say, I've got the control file on you now. Now, one of the reasons that he's doing this is he's supposed to retire based on his age. And Kennedy had already made plans to put in a new FBI director. And he talked with Exner about this. This is one of the things that she mentions, that he wanted to fire J. Edgar Hoover. So here's Kennedy, right, coming in, get rid of Allen Dulles. That's one big sacred cow in intel, and then get rid of Hoover. That's going right to the heart of it. And what was it that the Kennedys said? What's their quote behind the scenes to Arthur Schlesinger, their own historian, about LBJ? No, about Hoover. And they quote, say this about Hoover, that he was as dangerous as a rattlesnake. So, you know, you think about that, think about the level that they're on. That's how they felt about him. Incredibly dangerous, Hoover. My goodness. Yes.
At Kelly, did Marilyn Monroe know about the UFO program from JFK?
Yeah, I went through, I've been through a lot of documents about this one. And I was looking into this. It makes sense to me on two levels. One, she's very good friends with, you know, her relationships with Dorothy Kilgallen and others are very telling, because they adopt her in a sense. And so Kilgallen adopts her in that way, because she has that kind of I'm a lost orphan beauty thing going on. And what happens is Kilgallen hears a story about Roswell. And this is an interesting thing. Roswell happens in 1947. There's that one story that comes out in the newspaper, goes worldwide, but then they shut it down and say it's a weather balloon. Roswell is lost. There's no 50s, 60s, or 70s history about Roswell until you get to 1979. So it's a lost story. There's no book series and TV series and all that stuff. That all comes later because Jesse Marcel lets it out. So therefore, there's an echo in there for real reporters, somebody who's heard something. Those on the inside know a lot about Roswell. I pointed out on this program a couple of weeks ago about Roswell in relation to 7 Days in May, and how the COJ commander is played by Burt Lancaster is going to take over. And then right behind him on a map is Roswell. Now, Kennedy allowed them to use the White House and did everything he could to get that movie made. He knew that this idea of a COG commander with a base in the desert and Roswell on the map is enough scenery to give people some idea what's happening. And he said he would do anything to make sure people got a look at this. So when we think of it that way, you know, we get some idea of what's happening here with Marilyn. She's getting intel and information from Kennedy on one hand, and also from Kilgallen, and both of them know a great deal about the UFO file. So it stands to reason. Now, there's an FBI document that came out that's always been sus because people have wondered, was this thing leaked on purpose? Is it a piece of misinformation or whatever? But it's the Sperglio document. And what happens in that document is he tracks these different reasons, and the conversations that this woman, Marilyn Monroe, is having with Kennedy, and then the conversations she has in her own. And one of the things that she mentions is, you know, she's been told about a secret air base where they keep UFOs. So how much do I put in that document is a good question. I think it's likely that she knew something about it. And I think it makes her, look, she was on a very heavy duty FBI surveillance list. And true, she came out of Hollywood, and they suspected people in Hollywood of being communists. True, she had married Arthur Miller, who also had his troubles with the whole McCarthy era piece. So they could have been tracking her for that. But in my mind, the main reason she was such a focus and a female target is because of her relationship with Kennedy and because of what he may have told her. And certainly, I think he may have told her about the UFO file because he told others about it. Yes.
So did you mention Marilyn's diary?
That's another one, which is, we have two things there. You know, we have the diary of Mary Meyer, which Jesus James Angleton goes to get immediately. So he wants it because he knows that she's doing the research on the CIA assassinating President Kennedy. So when she's bumped off, he has to go get it quickly because he doesn't somehow, he's not able to get it while she's alive. And in the case of Marilyn Monroe, there's this whole thing about her diary because she kept a diary, and then with all this stuff again about the Kennedys being there and anything else. So in both scenarios, the diaries disappear. In the case of Mary Meyer, supposedly, Ben Bradley and her sister, Toni, his wife, show up and they find Angleton there. And he says, I can't find the diary. And then later they learned that he did find it and burned it. But that all it said, it was just a diary of her art or something like that, some ridiculous cover story.
Then why burn it?
Well, here's what's interesting. That, and I actually have some quotes on this that I can read. But one of the things that's interesting in relation to all this is that if you look at what happened there, that he had to go on the record saying, I'm looking for this diary, that Ben Bradley, who was pretty good at keeping CIA secrets, but, if you kill his sister-in-law, he might be inclined to out you. And for him to report that Angleton was at the apartment, I think is a really telltale sign. He's saying Jesus Angleton was involved not only in Mary Meyer's death, but quite possibly in Kennedy's death. And of course, he was. Okay, I found the von Braun quote that I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a quote, actually, but it's very fascinating. According to UFO authors Brad Steiger and Joan Wittenauer, von Braun told West German newspapers that in 1958 of a malfunction by a U.S. Juno rocket had been deflected off course by an unnamed and presumably extraterrestrial source. The following year, he elaborated to News Europe that we find ourselves faced by powers, quote, which are far stronger than we had hitherto assumed and whose base of operations is at present unknown to us. More I cannot say at present. We are now engaged in entering into closer contact with these powers, and in 6 or 9 months' time, it may be possible to speak with more precision on the matter. That's the quote. The Von Braun Astronomical Society, founded in 1954 by high schooler Sam Pruitt, under von Braun's direction, still maintains a 13-acre tract of land atop Mount Sano Mountain, near where the Torbit document identifies a disk field office in Huntsville, Alabama. Von Braun's interest in space ran with that of Albert Thomas. And Albert Thomas is interesting. I'll do a separate show on him, but he's the guy who was on the plane there with LBJ and Winks when LBJ is being sworn in. And they caught that photo of them. And that's the whole setup is weird. But Thomas really controlled the whole NASA piece. Thomas, since 1941, had served on the powerful House Appropriations Committee. Over the years, he'd voted to prevent workers from striking during the war and to increase Navy pay, but for the most part, he was a loyal liberal New Dealer. By JFK's day, his Appropriations Committee position exerted an enormous influence on how the federal budget was spent. Now, this is interesting. He shows up in an interesting way because he chaired the Independent Offices Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, which controlled the funds for the Atomic Energy Commission as well as NASA. Now, what's interesting, the AEC becomes very fascinating because Kennedy goes there and he does like a surprise visit, and there's a rumor that there's basically a UFO graveyard there, and that's part of what the AEC for. So if you have a place that deals with atomic materials, it's going to be incredibly top secret on one hand, but also if you already have it and people assume that it's under secret control for that, if you put UFOs there, then it's going to make a lot of sense to do it. But Kennedy's visits to these places, again, is to assert control. Here, you're holding this UFO material. I'm showing up. I'm the president. You owe the control to me. And we know that Eisenhower had these issues as well. We don't know what happens with LBJ and the UFO file. This is a weird thing. One, we know that he has a friend, James McDonald, who does a major study on UFOs, but he runs afoul of LBJ and Congress, and he ends up committing suicide, supposedly. And we also know there's a document that came out with a group like an MJ-12 Project Blue Book group that studied the UFO file under LBJ. And when you look at those names, that becomes interesting. Some of the names in there, one of the guys was involved in the Cosmos Club, and I did an episode on that last year. So I think some of this comes back around. What I want to point out, though, as we have von Braun in the 50s mentioning that the malfunction of a U.S. rocket had been deflected off course by an unnamed, presumably extraterrestrial source. So there's a head fake into this back then. How would people handle it? It's a good question. Yes.
I wanted to make sure I got this in here. Rose Thistle Artwork says JFK's secretary was on the Traveling Antique Show, that's Antiques Roadshow on PBS, and talked about having to ride on LBJ's plane back from Dallas. They were cheering and drinking champagne. It disturbed her.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty interesting. There's a lot of strange stories about that. And there's no question that...
We know the Murchison house was like that. They were drinking champagne for a week afterwards.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, LBJ shows up as a very sleazy character on a number of levels. And he sleazed himself onto the ticket. And, but he may have been a necessary evil for them to get Texas and win the election. It's hard to say. But his attitude towards the Kennedys, it's interesting because there's a guy who worked closely with him, and he said, why would you want to give up your role as Senate Majority Leader? Come on. You're the boss of everything. The vice presidential role is one of the worst roles, period. And he said, no, I'm going to be president. And, this aide to LBJ is like, what do you mean? And he said, Kennedy's not going to live through his term. So the guy assumed he was, because he had raised all this stuff about Kennedy's health, that he knew something. But, later it occurred to him, he knew back then when he got in that they were going to assassinate Kennedy. There's a number of different things about LBJ and that show he was involved in the assassination. And the question is, it was a matter of survival also because Kennedy was already working to oust him as vice president. And he knew without that protection of being vice president, he was going to jail because his friends were going to jail for the misdeeds of the Senate committee and as Senate Majority Leader, the things he had done there. And they had created all these allotments, from the government to create these programs. Cotton allotments was one of them in Texas. And so Billy Celestes, his close associate, these guys were going to prison and he was going down with them. And RFK always knew that he was a sleaze and was kind of accentuating the process. So for LBJ, it was a very simple decision. This guy gets bumped off and I get to be president or I go to prison, but I think that LBJ, when he takes over as president, he owes that deep state machine the Vietnam War, and that's what they get through him. But even he, at a certain point, is overwhelmed with that. And when Robert Kennedy says, I'm running in 1968, LBJ turns around and says, what? He says, I'm getting out of this race. I'm resigning. I'm not going to run, which is ridiculous. What sitting president doesn't run for re-election? Doesn't happen. So, for him to get out of it is weird. Well, that's March 31st. And then June 8th, they kill Robert Kennedy. So if he knows Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King are going to be assassinated, then he knows who's the beneficiary. If there's no Kennedy, I'm the beneficiary. I can't be around for another Kennedy assassination. I'm out of here. So, this is the nature of that thing. But if you look at those three leaders in that period of time being assassinated in under 5 years, the leader, President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, it's too much of, it's a war that takes place, and all of the, pandering by the media to this idea that, well, the 60s were hard, but, liberals made the day, it ignores a vital fact of history, which is there was a civil war that took place in the 1960s, and the deep state overtook the public state because they felt they were so at risk with the Kennedys. The level of the informed nature of the Kennedys with their power base was too much for them to coexist. And so they turned to assassination as the solution. Yes.
I really want to cover this. Gary Smith, why did author Robert Caro not go into LBJ's crimes? Can you talk about deep state authors and and biographies, biopics, and things like that? And
yes. Well, a lot of that stuff is bankrolled by the very same elite forces that we're talking about. And so there are areas that you just don't go into. So they can say, oh, so-and-so slept with so-and-so, or, they had a illegitimate child or something like that. But they cannot go in and say he ordered the assassination of, Henry Marshall, so that these different things that they do, and they skirt very close to the truth. They will actually bring out some very important points. But then some people are just put up there to slam a lid on it, and they'll get paid for doing that. And, we've had jokers around like that, like Gerald Posner and people like that.
Joker of jokers.
And, they just will repeat things, and the media will repeat it with them. But if you dig in even a half inch deep, what they're working with isn't true. So, if you had somebody who was an honest academician, and, one of the news people was saying, well, in studying this story, Oswald was a Soviet defector who hated the United States, that honest academician would say, well, he worked for a right-wing, ex-FBI leader, Guy Bannister, who was close to the UFO file. How do you explain that? So, this is the nature of the truth that they can't go into. If they just stay on this one track, which has been laid out as the narrative, and we get it all the time, the thing that's happening with FTX is exactly the same. Oh, Bankman-Fried, and what he wanted to do was save the world, but his plans went up in smoke because he was too young to know what he was doing. So, the fact that people lost $400 billion in the worst Ponzi scheme in history doesn't get any play. And the New York Times invites him on panels to explain how even with the best of intentions, this terrible thing happened. I mean, this is the nature of the sick reality that they're in. And, unfortunately, historians like Caro and others, they miss the real story. I remember Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she's one I was mentioning. But there's a couple of things that are interesting there. One, when she would talk about the assassination and things, she would say, on the conspiracy series that were thread, about LBJ and all the rest of it. And then if you go into her bio, you learn that in 1970, she had a 2-year affair with LBJ as a journalist. Now, whatever, that's her personal life, but you're probably not going to get an objective position from somebody who was sleeping with LBJ about LBJ. She could write an autobiography and talk about it, but she can't, as a historian, give an objective point of view. So, probably what they should say when they put her up on PBS or whatever is, former lover of LBJ instead of historian when she talks about it. So it's a weird, the whole thing is weird. But then again, did they select somebody like that so they would, say things that weren't controversial? I think that whole environment of the media and their corruption has come out. But nothing, what could be more corrupt than the New York Times sitting there with Bankman-Fried and letting him spin and inviting him to these panels after he stole billions of dollars, with this Ponzi scheme in the Bahamas. Obviously he was giving money to the right people, but it's a sick, that's a sick commentary on the society where it is, and where it needs to go is a totally different place. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I wanted to add this. Fuber Fighter, we had a great thread where, so Goodbye Norma Jean was trending on Twitter.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And that's because Elton John has decided to leave because of Elon, right? But we have Elton, who of course sang about Norma Jean, Marilyn, but who was inspired by Liberace. And we have Trelane
Oh, right.
dressing like Liberace.
So you're saying now that we just synchronicity just is out of control here, and it's tumbling
Yes.
downhill like a
pretzel.
snowball.
Mhm.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep, deep tonight. This is Female Targets, and it's X Series 141, the Deep State JFK Assassination. We'll take a few more of your questions, and then we're going to wrap it up tonight. I do have a couple of quotes that I'll read to close out tonight as well. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Hold on, I'm gotta take a sip.
Oh, yes. One of the things I wanted to mention also is please do sign up for a free newsletter that keeps us in touch. It is exactly the best way for us to stay in touch, because there's so many issues around our presence on social media and a number of things going on in that department that, it's the best way to make sure that you do it, especially if you're new to the program. Go ahead and sign up for the newsletter. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, a lot of the interviews that we have coming up for December are going to be very, very interesting. And the X series episodes for January are going to focus on the mystery schools. So that's a big one for us to stay in the loop on. So we're going to do a whole month dedicated down the line on the mystery schools and their impact, because in 2023 they're going to be oh so important. And that was Gigi had just done something about the mystery schools recently, and her stuff is great actually to check out. I want to recommend it. And I wanted to mention that somebody, people have been sending me this all week, but apparently Robbie Williams did a big shout out for the Dark Journalist Show. And that's great. The other thing that's interesting about that is he spoke about it and then talked about his own interest in mystery schools. And of course, he's this remarkable singer from the UK. And he knew all about Steiner. So you see, there's a number of things. There's a lot of encouraging things going on.
Yeah,
there.
You never know who's in the audience.
So more power to you, Robbie, and good going, because those are deep subjects. And I understand that he's had his own UFO contacts. So that whole thing is very, very interesting. And so I hope to be hearing more about that. Yes.
Okay. Bill Davis, please ask DJ if he's heard of James Hepburn's book, Farewell America, published in 1968 about Kennedy's killing not allowed in the U.S. at that time.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. And there's a series of books. There's about 4 books that were suppressed heavily, but a lot of them had to do, I'm trying to remember if that's one of them, but a lot of them had to do with French intelligence and the link to de Gaulle, because I think that when people went back to the de Gaulle assassination attempt, that what happened was it trailed too closely and tracked too closely with Kennedy's assassination. So they had to get rid of all the references because it went back to Permindex, which is the assassination group, the permanent index of people to be assassinated, as Dr. Farrell would say. And this is very interesting because although we're looking at those documents for December 15th, the JFK records, all of the documents for Bloomfield, who was in charge of Permindex, and when they got booted out of Italy, had to keep them afloat in Montreal. That whole piece is very important for a lot of reasons. But Bloomfield's, his papers have been in the center of a court battle since 2003. And so that's almost 20 years. And that court battle and his documents are every bit as revelatory as what they would have in the JFK assassination files, because Bloomfield was closely associated with Bush. And he was also closely associated with Bronfman. And that corridor of Montreal mafia, intel, aerospace interest is what's missing in this discourse. And you do not hear about it, except when you get into things that we're doing here and through Joseph's work. And, there were guys, I'm trying to think of the guy who wrote the Men in Black book, but Ken Thomas did a series of good books around this, and then the person he was doing it with. But in any case, those were
Jim Keith?
Yes, Jim
Mhm.
Keith. Exactly. Bingo. That's who it was. Keith is somebody who died mysteriously. And, it was very strange because Keith got into a lot of where this needs to go. So let's remember that. There's a reason, I think, for that. The other person who died under suspicious circumstances is Mac Tonnies, and he was writing a very small book there about crypto-terrestrials, who were a group that he felt were here, but they were just a little more advanced technologically than the average human being, and they were able to keep themselves kind of blended into society that way. Well, that's an interesting theory. The book is interesting, but his death is unusual, and so whenever I see things like that, it makes you take a second look. There's no question about it. And I think there's a rich legacy of work there with people like Keith. And, Mae Brussell's work, we've talked about Mae Brussell. Her insight about how the Exner, Gincana, CIA military contractor using celebrities, this is very important too. Look, Frank Sinatra, who did all this stuff in the mid 70s, he is seen taking Jacqueline Kennedy to a Broadway play. Now, that's pretty wild because it's very well known that he set up JFK, with a lot of women, and Exner was one of them. This seemed to be a strange thing. But, Gincana died in the 70s and things of this nature. And so he may have been trying to help reach out to Jackie at that point. And but whatever it is, that's an unusual piece. But you find those kind of gems in the middle of Mae Brussell's work. Absolutely fascinating. Yes.
Phil Colbert says Final Judgment by Michael Collins Piper talks about the Israeli connection with JFK. Funny, the ADL tried to stop the book, and Michael also died under mysterious circumstances.
Oh, that is a very interesting book. There's a real interesting case. Here's what was going on with Kennedy, and this involved a number of different countries. But Kennedy did not want the nuclear race to get out of hand. This is what he was trying to stop, and you can see why. Look at the nonsense where we're doing bluster over Ukraine because, we're taking on Russia. Like, every president from FDR, we've had a Cold War with Russia, but who would actually think, except Stepford Biden, about having an actual on-the-ground war with a nuclear-armed country? It's ridiculous. Especially the nature of Russia's nukes, right? We were neck and neck during the Cold War. And so, if anything, you want to help them safeguard their nukes and not get into a nuclear situation with them. This is pure idiocy, like beyond idiocy. But I think, it begs the question with Kennedy. What was going on was he was saying to Israel, look, I understand your position, we'll defend you, but do not develop your own nuclear weapons because you'll set off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. We can't have it. I'm already having enough of a hard time trying to prevent my own generals from getting involved in a nuclear war with Russia. So they were like, sure, we'll do it. And then he keeps finding out that they're going to develop it. And at a certain point, they think that he's planning, they set up a plan to blockade their own nuclear base against any American attacks. They're setting themselves up so that if Kennedy decides to bomb a nuclear facility in Israel, that they'll do it. That's the level that they're thinking on. So what's unusual, I think, when we track back the static with Israel and Kennedy is that James Jesus Angleton, who is the one who we find right in the heart of the Mary Myers story, searching through her apartment immediately after she's shot. They erect this incredible statue in the middle of Jerusalem to James Jesus Angleton, who's a CIA agent here. That's weird. So he did a number of things for Israel, and was the Kennedy piece included with that? Well, if you want to look for an Israeli connection around the aerospace track, they're there. But you're not going to find that Israel is responsible for the JFK assassination. But you might find that they were involved. Because the nature of that X-Protect group, it does not know any limits in terms of who's involved. They're working with other countries, and they're working with other defense facilities. Yes.
Rehoboth Farm. What about Wilbur Ross on the Space Council with Mike Pence?
That's pretty wild. Well, think about, look, Pence was incredibly dynamic about going to the moon. And this whole Artemis stuff that they set up after the fact, is far more delayed than anything that he wanted to do. So as part of that Space Force thing, he had adopted the Space Council immediately when he got in. And then Trump had him involved with Space Force. Now, traditionally, they do have the vice president do something involved with space. But I think the Pence-Trump piece around Space Force is still mysterious. And remember that the person heading up Space Force, General Chance, he is his background was in that incredible he's associated with the same base that had an incredible incident in Montana with a UFO going over and shutting off the nuclear sites one by one. That's his background. He spent 10 years there. And then the person who's heading up NORAD COG, Northcom, is, General Van Herk, who comes out of the 509th, which is the same bomber group that our friend in Roswell came out of, Jesse Marcel. So, there's an awful lot of UFO signaling going on in those positions. I'll put it to you that way. Yes. Someone in the audience shout out the Montana 1967 nuclear UFO incident. I want to see it in live time. Okay, go for it.
David Tormeda wanted to remind you, Jim Keith was the guy who first connected Alternative 3 to disclosure.
Wow. Isn't that impressive? It's an incredible discovery. And think of all the waves of people who've come after the fact doing that. And I always love the trendsetters on that level. That's why Flamand, I think, is very important. His work is very important. And I think, when it comes to the JFK work, Peter Dale Scott's insight on what was happening, that's in, the Deep Politics and Death of JFK book, that's 1992. So, all of that work is now kind of caught up for the things that he was speculating then. But I mean, absolutely remarkable. Yes.
Pierce Tessier Ashpool says Jack Parsons got blown up for trying to defect to Israel.
That's right. Wow. Yeah. Boy, is that on the money.
You played with the deep state, right? And this is what happens, right?
Well, he played with the deep state, and he played with the deep occult state as well. As I've pointed out, there's an agency, an astral agency involved with the Central Intelligence Agency. And I'll tell you, there's no political researcher who wants to talk with me about that. But I want to talk about it, so I will, anyway. But it is kind of interesting because if people check out the deep state aspects, they can see, if you go into it, well, the CIA is interested in all sorts of drugs, mind control, zombies, ancient civilizations, the Sphinx, Edgar Casey's Hall of Records. They put a whole group inside the ARE in 1964 to try to find out about it. Noah's Ark. Why is the Central Intelligence Agency interested? To what end? Those things have to be opened up. Well, if I found information around an astral agency that had to do with Sami people out of John Keel's research, it's a huge lead. And I spend, a good amount of time trying to figure out what that one is about, because the people who were identified as the Men in Black look exactly like what Keel found were, the native Sami people who were Laplanders. So, and if you go back on that track, there's a whole fascinating mystical thing there. They're known as healers, psychics. You know, is that a resource that the Central Intelligence Agency would use? Yes. We know about the remote viewing program. Yes. So the Astral Agency? Yes. Makes perfect
Can
sense
we
to
talk
me.
about that for a minute?
Well, we'll do a
There's
show.
definitely
We'll do
interest
we'll do
in
a show on it
the idea
for
of-
sure.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you, because I'm dying to ask this question. At one point, it would make sense that the Astral Agency would be completely organic. At this point, have they merged with technology? Are they utilizing technology as part of their spellcasting?
Oh, absolutely. Well,
And how would one go about doing that?
well, you know, I mean, a shaman's drum is technology, technically, right? So when you get into utilizing things, you can utilize anything. You can utilize a communications device, whatever it would happen to be. You know, a charm bracelet. Where do these things come from? There's a whole deep wave of knowledge around that, and
We have to do this episode.
oh yeah, no
We have
question.
to.
Well, it pertains to numerology. It pertains to astrology. Remember the group that Jesus was associated with, the Essenes. What did they practice? They practiced numerology, palmistry, astrology, you know, dream interpretation. There's a whole thing about these mystical Essenes and the idea of astral travel, you know. So this is the nature of the mystery schools, and certainly the Essenes qualify as one of the highest mystery schools. There's still very little, and we need to know a great deal more about them, but there's a lot about them in the Edgar Cayce readings, which is absolutely fascinating. Everyone, it's been a fantastic episode here with female targets, and there's more to come on them. And Karen Kupcinet and Judith Exner, Marilyn Monroe, and Mary Meyer were incredible women who were faced with incredible connections and had incredible relationships with powerful people that put them in a position where they were sometimes acting incredibly courageously. In the case of Exner, she was carrying messages back and forth between Kennedy and not only the mafia, but military contractors. I didn't get into that part too much, but I do want to say this, that it appears to me, there's an actual quote from Exner where she's giving back from Kennedy when he is giving these military contractors a particular thing. They're handing him back like plans. And, you know, when you look at that and you think about the things that he was working on, let's use this as a closing thought for this episode. President Kennedy, when he wanted to talk with Chairman Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, he didn't go through State Department channels. He went through a newsman who was there in DC, who would get a message, take it in his newspaper, go on a plane, go over there, meet his contact in Berlin. The person in Berlin would take the message then to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev would read the message directly. This infuriated the CIA and the State Department because they wanted to see that first. Well, here we have Kennedy going behind the scenes, and he is working, giving messages through Judith Exner to Sam Giancana. A lot of people have speculated on the nature of the messages he was giving to Giancana. It seems to me, since we know that the CIA was trying to hire the mafia to assassinate Castro, that he's gathering information on what the CIA are doing with the mafia. Makes a lot more sense to me than he's hiring the mafia to kill Castro. But with the aerospace military contractors, the messages that he's sending over and sending back, in my opinion, pertain directly to the X technology in the UFO file. That's what's so fascinating, is that Judith Exner finds herself poised right in the middle of that as well. And she thinks, hey, I'm handling messages for the president back and forth. And Frank Sinatra's my friend. Sam Giancana's this other guy who's interested in me, you know, and I'm doing this incredibly important work. Think about what was actually taking place there with her. I find it absolutely fascinating. Mary Meyer, trying to change the trajectory of the world by helping Kennedy develop his peace policy, and ending up dead after having married a CIA agent who was most likely involved in the president's murder as well. So being right in the heart of that, and getting killed because of what she was finding out, not being afraid, but finding out about the president's murder. Incredibly courageous. Karen Kupcinet, think of what she did. Here's a 22-year-old girl who hears this information, probably from her father, and tries to communicate with authorities a half hour before it happens, and is just distraught, in relation to it. Nonetheless, it's an incredibly courageous effort that she makes there, and she pays for it with her life. In the case of Exner, as I said, her life was marginalized dramatically. She didn't die because I think her connections, with Sinatra and Giancana, I don't think it allowed for that. And also she was outed by the committee as being associated. So I think that saved her. And in the case of Marilyn, there's an incredible track there of Marilyn and her associations. And but certainly, again, Marilyn is somebody who just, had made an indelible impression on the world, and was a remarkable, remarkable woman. And she also was, this is something that's not very widely known, an incredibly enthusiastic anthroposophist. And did you know that she got a complete reading from Edgar Cayce when she was a teenager? So these are remarkable people for a reason, in my opinion. And
where's the proof of that?
No, it's well known.
No, on the Cayce one.
Kirkpatrick and other people have uncovered it.
And
yeah.
Do they know what number it is?
It's a beauty reading.
Ah.
It's a beauty reading. Yeah. It's well known, though. I think even.
So do we have access to it?
Yes.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah. And those secrets may have taken it right there. I think there's a beauty book about Cayce that has that reading in it. So they had that. They got the information about that reading in, I think, the 1970s, that it was from Maryland. Now, what's funny is George Gershwin, as we know, got readings from Cayce. And what's his name? The other, Cole Porter, and Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, most of the crew of The Wizard of Oz. And it's kind of very interesting, the people who came to Cayce for readings. I'm always fascinated by that. And with that, everyone,
one last question.
Yes.
Okay, Najat Madri. Does DJ think that JFK had a deep state faction the way Trump had one behind him? And if JFK had one, they abandoned him in order to be assassinated, yes?
Yeah, well, he had an incredible base politically. And I think, honestly, that the large portion of the American deep state was behind Nixon, in fact. But they were aware of the long arm of the Kennedys' influence. And I think that they felt that they couldn't do anything to stop that except to try to influence his policies. And when they realized that they couldn't, like, fake him into an all-out war in Cuba, which is what Dulles did, they decided, yeah, in fact, we have to just remove him. And there's a number of different sources about when they arrived at that conclusion. But remember that the Central Intelligence Agency, there's a guy named Tom Corson, who is very interesting because he would later give information to Jim Garrison about what was going on behind closed doors in the military, and also write powerful books on Vietnam and others. And it turns out, actually, that he may be a distant relative of Gigi Young. Interestingly enough, we talked with Gigi about that a couple of years ago. But he's very interesting because what he says is that the Central Intelligence Agency ordered a psychological profile on President Kennedy before he was president, and that usually they did it when there was somebody incoming, when they knew they were going to be president, and then they became president. With Kennedy, they did it during the campaign. So they're sizing him up very early. And if you think about some of the comments, that LBJ made about, oh, I'm not going to be vice president, I'm going to take over as president, then it becomes pretty obvious that maybe this assassination planning went on very, very early, but required a large scale trigger. One of the triggers that's interesting, you'll find in the language, and when you look into some of these stories about the relatives who talk about the people who were involved, or if you look at E. Howard Hunt's language when he's talking to Caddy, Roscoe White, is another one who gets told this. We have Ricky White's testimony on this. And he was the Dallas policeman who, mirrored Oswald in so many ways. But what they say is that they have to eliminate a national security threat. So in the case of Kennedy, him wanting to share the UFO file makes him a national security threat to them, because they need a rationale to convince their group to go along with this. So, they have the provocation there. They have the ability to do it. But when you see that come up over and over again, I find it interesting. The other term that comes up is alien presence, which is, Kennedy wants to give away our most vital secret. This is what the Watergate lawyer said, that E. Howard Hunt said to him, right? This is what Caddy told me on this program. So what's the most vital secret? What would be the biggest national security secret? What are you talking about? And basically that Hunt said the alien presence, the UFO file. That's what Kennedy wanted to share with the Russians. That's a big problem for that whole group. So when we get into this thing about December 15th with all the JFK records supposedly coming out, and when they don't, or when they're spun out and they say, hey, look, it was the Soviets. We understand what's going on. But the fact that there are counter suits, I think, opens up the conversation larger in the public. And if anything, we have the comments from Trump about what might be in those records related to Mar-a-Lago, maybe not. But the fact that he said that this could never come out, I think opens a lot about those records. And yet the actual records which might make the most difference in the Kennedy case are the Bloomfield records out of Canada relating to Permindex. So those are stealth archives, as we've communicated on these programs. We know that they're there, and those elite forces have allowed us to know that they're there, but we can't get our hands on them. But we both know that they're there. This is like the LBJ-X letter, which I've pointed out many times is due to be released next year, 2023. That's when he set it up to come out. He wrote, this is the X letter, and it is about 65 pages. And right after Nixon died, there was a premature opening of this, and they immediately classified it and said, oh no, we're going to wait. We're going to keep his original thing. But it's weird also that they tried to open it. Originally, it was thought, oh, maybe he taped Nixon and Nixon tried to delay the Vietnam peace process, and he wants that to come out. It doesn't work that way, in my opinion. I think LBJ, like all these presidents, figure some sort of disclosure is going to happen at some point, and I want my role in this known. And if he worked for NASA since the 50s and was called Senator NASA, then that's what that X letter is about. That's next year. That could be a very powerful door to open as we get close to the year. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up. You can say goodnight.
Okay. All right. So I've got a bunch of super chatters to thank. The Drunken Scoundrel, Gil and Joy R, Alex, help me out with this one, Dumitrescu,
Nice.
Erica Swenson Elliott, Christopher Lombardo, Irish Guy at Second Chance Recovery Channel, Neil Bauman, Wait a Minute 72, Red Cap Goblin, Eurythmy is Fun, Jim Sarge 3ID, Dorian Hewitt, Slow Time, Global Atlantis, Calvin Center, Melody Lenz, Norman Smith, Karen Carpenter, Brian Kinney, GDNPB, WC Ray, Jason May, Mer Bowman, Robert Scott, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Dorothy Gorska-Tyus, and now Gary Smith. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary. Fantastic. I really appreciate it. Great support from you guys, and it helps us do the things that we do here. And to all our subscribers, thank you. It allows us to go deep on these stories, and your support means a whole lot to us. We will be back with you. Very important interview coming up next Friday, and we might have a report for you in the interim, especially if the records are coming out on the 15th. If anything's going on there, maybe we'll live stream it. But it's fantastic. I'm going to do some shout outs here while I have you. Let's see. Was that I'm a Patinsky? Okay. Mental Grace. Thank you. Najat, it's great to see you out there. Thank you as well. Bernie Mac. Isn't there a song? Bernie Mac, right? What is that? Jimmy Mac. Okay. Can you sing? Give me that one.
No.
Give me that one. That's good. That was a good look. It was like, I can't sing. You guys must be exhausted. Great show. What's weird is I have so much energy. That's the thing. And that's what happens with these shows. If anything. Jack Nelson, Sovereign Brehan, Bernie Mac. Bernie Mac, it's twice. Tie Tract. Handsome Stranger, Bartow. Excellent.
We didn't get to talk about Bob Hope at all, but I had some good comments.
Thank you, Jimmy.
And questions.
Yeah, really. Yeah. Well, Bob is very interesting.
Well, Kathy O'Brien?
Yes. Well, close relationship with Nixon. We know that.
Sharon Baxter said, there's a reason there's a Bob Hope mask in Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, wow. Isn't that interesting? I didn't even think of that.
And Danielle Jorgensen said, to rebrand after being busted for trading with the enemy, Bush created the USO. And who is the quintessential face of the USO? Bob Hope. It makes you want to rethink what the real purpose was.
Esoteric Gold. Thank you. Now Kate's out
Everybody's
there.
so dirty.
Great to see you. David Tormina. Thank you, sir. Excellent. Jason Moore. Big time show yet again. Thank you, David. Golden Girl. Whew. Jason Moore. Jason May. Fubar Fighter. Excellent. What is that? Someday I wonder if Daniel could speculate on exactly what could be so fantastic that Trump couldn't release it. We're not grown up enough to know what it is. You know what's weird is I must have started a chain reaction with Napolitano, because after I mentioned that he did this, he seems to be now repeating this a lot, and now it's getting around. He's going on the record more with that conversation, and now I'm learning that the conversation happened in the last time that he talked to him about the records was December of 2020, post-election defeat. So in that corridor before J6 and all that, he was talking a lot about giving it up. Very interesting. William Fowley. Absolutely. William Fowley. What's interesting about that is if you look at an episode I did with Professor Scott, that was, I think, from 2017. We did touch on Polly, but Polly is so fascinating, and he's another one of these strange deaths associated with the House Assassinations Committee, HSCA. Birds Need Love. Okay. Golden Girl. Powers. All right. We got you all. Great ideas from incredible questions tonight. And on the female targets, these are deep levels here. There's no question about it. But from Connolly through Connolly's daughter through to Cupsonet and Exner and Marilyn, these are just incredible. Absolutely fascinating connections. So we know we're going to go deeper, and we will do female targets again shortly.
Can I throw you a last minute?
I heard
curveball?
JFK was on so many painkillers that he couldn't release the papers on it. I heard JFK was on so many painkillers that they couldn't release the papers on it. Yeah, well, look, he had back issues that made him wear crutches at times. But this is an interesting thing about JFK. I don't think it influenced him as much as they made that out, because it's always kind of a salacious thing to be like, hey, Dr. Feelgood was giving him uppers. And I know that he had to use drugs at certain times, but but I don't think he was like a real drug addict. And I think, it's hard to say. It's really weird too, when they talk about his love life and all these different types of things. And I think if you look at his love life when he was single and all the kind of romances he had and all that, I think he got addicted to this. And when he got married, which he didn't want to do, but he had to, because he was getting into his 30s. And as a senator, his father said, literally, if you don't get married, you're going to look gay. And this is how they looked at things in the 30s. And he said, you can't have that go around if you want to be successful in politics. And so he got a great wife in Jackie, but he, was still in this kind of mode. And I think when we look at Kennedy older, it isn't brought up a lot, but, there has to be a little bit of like, he's starting to go middle-age crazy and trying to recapture his youth a little bit. It's interesting because Exner makes a very telling comment on this. She says, when I first met him, he was, bright-eyed. He was running for president. There he is with Sinatra. He's doing all this stuff. By 1962, when I stopped seeing him, he was exhausted all the time. He was depressed. And, so it's kind of interesting, the state of the world and the things that he was doing, facing off against the Cuban Missile Crisis alone would be enough to cause you to need a lot of rehab. So, yeah, very interesting indeed, the things that he went through. But to think of him personally, he's pretty complex. Giza Death Star. Joseph, it's great to see you. Thank you, guys. Merry Christmas to you, DJ and Olivia, and everyone, and Happy New Year. Absolutely incredible. And we're looking next year for your new book on the pyramids. I'm waiting for it. That's what they should do a Netflix special on. That's what I'm looking for. And I'm glad they did the Graham Hancock one. See, some good stuff is popping up, as it were. And the Bimini episode there is interesting stuff. Although I wish they had mentioned Edgar Casey. Wow, fantastic. All right, so great to see so many of you tonight, and we will see you all next week. Like I said, important interview coming up next Friday. Don't miss it. And I will probably see you with a live stream around the records release going on next week. And, it says end broadcast, Miss Olivia, but
never really ends.
Never really ends. Fantastic. Thank you all so much. It's been great to be here with you tonight, and we'll see you all next week. Have a great one. And with that, we'll say good night.
Okay. God bless.